Hello, son. We're near 5,000 subscribers already. Our community grows larger and larger. Thank you for warming my heart these last days. They've been tough mentally and health-wise. Anyhow, tonight, I'll narrate as usual. 3 hours of scary deep woods and national park horror stories. So grab your pipe, sit on your porch chair, and let's rock, son. I was at work one day in the late fall. It was 1995 at a national park in the state of Washington. The name will be redacted for the story. It was late morning around 11. The weather was overcast around 50 or 60 degrees. There wasn't much wind. Work was slow that day, and I was alone in the tower monitoring the parking lots of the trailheads. It would be nice to have some distraction, so I decided to radio down to the other rangers at the visitor center, asked them if they wanted to come up to the tower with me. Most just said they would be as soon as they were available. At this point, I decided to just continue my slow patrols of the parking lots, hoping I would run into somebody I could talk to. I went to the northmost parking lot and began walking slowly down the road that ran behind the lot. As I walked, I looked around for cars that looked like they had been parked for a while and trash in the parking lot. As I reached the end, I noticed something on the other side of the road. It was standing just left to the road, maybe 50 yards away. I stopped and looked at it, thinking it might be a person that was just getting out of the car, but it didn't move. So I assumed it was a person until I got a better look. I started walking towards it, thinking it may have just been somebody. As I got closer, it just stood there, frozen, and then was facing me. It kept its head moving back and forth like it was looking around, and I realized this was not a person at all. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in brown fur that was very long, kind of like that of a sheep or a bear. But the head was white with a pointy snout, big round eyes that did not seem to have any visible eyelids. Its arms were like human, but they seemed very long and had a lot of muscle and definition to them. Even with all the fur, it was standing on 2 legs like an upright person would, but kind of leaning forward on its hands almost. It had a flatter face, at least beside the snout. I noticed I didn't have any teeth, at least that I saw. I'm not sure what I was looking at. It was very strange, but the most strange thing was its lower body. It kind of resembled more like that of a kangaroo because of how its legs were bent backwards towards its butt. I kept thinking to myself, I'm either going crazy or somebody is in a very elaborate costume. The more I kept staring at it, I realized that it must be somebody playing a joke, but it looked far too realistic. I was scared at this point, and I just stood there looking at it and trying to figure out what it was and what to do. It then looked back at me exactly, and I heard a voice. It was one of the other rangers that I had called earlier. He was asking me what I was doing, and I told him I had found something out in the far parking lot and wanted him to come take a look. It was then that I heard its voice. It was almost telepathically. It was kind of like a growling sound, but more like a series of sounds that sounded more like a language than just a growl. I don't know how to explain it, but it was the most terrifying thing I've ever heard. I turned around and started walking as fast as I could back to the tower. I was halfway there when I looked back and saw this thing was following me. I made it to the tower and got up as fast as I could. It was still standing now in the parking lot. Now I thought I might try and climb over the fence, but it did not. I looked back several times and never crossed the road. One of the other rangers came up about a half hour later. I told him what I saw. I'd asked him to go out there with me, but he refused. I called the other rangers from other parks. They wouldn't come out either, even though they laughed at me. I still think part of them believed me. I never saw it again after this, but I don't think I could ever face it again. I haven't told my wife about it. She thought I was crazy and does not believe me. I'm not crazy. I do not know what that thing was, but I know I saw it. From that day on, the incident haunted me. I couldn't shake the image of that creature from my mind. I often found myself staring into the woods, wondering if it was still out there, waiting for me. I tried to tell my superiors and colleagues, but they refused to believe me. I was labeled as a delusional old ranger who had spent too much time alone in the wilderness. I was forced to retire soon after, and I've been living in isolation ever since. I know what I saw that day was real, and I know that it's still out there. I've heard stories from other people who have encountered similar creatures in the woods, and it's clear that it's not just a figment of my imagination. I can only hope that it never crosses paths with any unsuspecting hiker or camper. But who knows? Maybe it already has. I lived in a haunted house. I was never afraid of supernatural, but it was a strange year living there. When we visited the house the first time, I felt this strange, unsettling feeling. I didn't want to live there, but I was 16 at the time, and I had no vote in the house my mom would choose, and it ended up being this one. Thankfully, it was a rental, so we could leave any time. There was an old blue trailer in the yard. The homeowner told us we could make any change to the house, but we could not touch the trailer ever. We never even went near it. It was old and filthy, and we didn't care for it. During the time that we lived there, a series of stuff happened that we couldn't really explain at the time, but like I said, I was never really afraid of supernatural. We would clean, and suddenly the floor would be covered in muddy dog feet. No dogs around. One night I want to change a lamp standing on a ladder. The ladder tips over. I nearly hit my head on a sink. It was really close, but no reason for the ladder to tip over. In 1 year, our house gets hit by lightning 3 times, going front to back, breaking every single thing that was plugged into electricity. One of these times, my brother was outside in the back, taking in some stuff he left outside, so it wouldn't get wet from the rain. Lightning hits, and he gets ejected at least 3 meters through the air across the lawn, hit a fence, and falls on the ground. Miraculously, he's shook but unharmed. One night I wake up having to use the bathroom. I get up and hear water running, so I walk into the bathroom. Nothing. I wake my mom, tell her I hear water. She does too. We go downstairs. It's flooded, ankle high already. A pipe burst. Mind you, those pipes were replaced when we moved in as part of the agreement, so they were new. Another day I come home. We got a kitten. I find its head in the living room. Blood and nothing else. Looked like something ate it. It was horrible. For the longest time, there was this girl who would walk in and out the house. We usually only caught a glimpse of her, mostly heard her giggle. This was a friendly neighborhood, so we figured it was one of the neighbors' kids who was curious and playing games. We let her be. For a long time after that, nothing out of the ordinary happened, but we wanted out of the house. We found a new place, and while we were moving, one of the neighbors comes to ask if we need help. He glances at the old trailer and says so. That thing is still here, huh? I told him we weren't allowed to touch it. Asked him if he knew why. Since he was so interested in it, I thought he might know. He told me the people who originally bought the ground to build the house lived in that trailer until the house was ready. They never finished it because the dad shot his 6-year-old daughter and wife and then committed self-harm. Because of some formalities, the case was never closed, and the trailer was a crime scene, which made it illegal to take away or enter it, he continued. After those people died, the house was bought by a dog breeder. He finished the house, and one night he wanted to change a lamp, and his ladder tips over, hit his head on the sink, and he died. To this day, I am certain those 2 families and even the dogs were present in that house. I am a cop in Alaska. I worked nights and was in the outskirts of town. Myself and 2 other officers responded to a family's house where they heard someone howling like a wolf under their back deck. When I was on my way, another officer called me and said that he had been to the neighbor's house earlier. The department had had a few problems with the neighbor where he had called several times saying someone was breaking into his house, but there was no one there and there was no sign of anyone being there. No tracks in fresh snow. That night the neighbor thought that someone was breaking into his house. He called the cops and went outside to confront the person. When he went outside, he didn't find anyone, and though he saw someone in his window, so he shot at his own house. When the police got there was no evidence of someone going into the house. The general consensus was that the neighbor was crazy. So while we were going to the call, we think the crazy neighbor has gone under the deck and was howling. When we got there, we spoke to the homeowner, and they asked us to walk around the house. We didn't find any footprints. The other officers looked into the woods a little bit, and I spoke to the homeowner. They said that they swore they heard howling under their deck. The wife said that a week earlier she saw the police go to the neighbor's house, and when the police walked around the house, a skinny man with a dark jacket and long dark hair ran around from the other side of the house and ran into the woods. We looked further into the woods and found tracks that lead to another person's house, then further into the woods where we lost the trail. We told them to lock their doors and to call us next time they heard or saw anything. Maybe the neighbor wasn't crazy. I couldn't believe my eyes as I stared at the lifeless body of my sergeant. He had taken his own life in the police station and left behind a note with coordinates. I knew I had to investigate. The coordinates led to a remote part of Yellowstone National Park. I knew it was a long shot, but something compelled me to follow through. I set out on a long drive to the park, unsure of what I would find. When I arrived, I met a park ranger who told me that the area I was headed to was off limits to visitors. I knew I had to be careful, so I lied and told him I was just there to do some hiking. He reluctantly let me pass, but warned me to stay on the designated trails. As I hiked deeper into the woods, the smell of rotting flesh grew stronger. I knew I was getting close to something, but I had no idea what it could be. Suddenly I saw a cave in the distance. My heart raced as I approached it, unsure of what I would find inside. As I neared the entrance, a terrifying creature emerged. It had the body of a man, but the head of a dog. It let out a roar that sent shivers down my spine. I reached for my gun, but my hands were shaking so badly that I missed my target. The creature charged at me, tackling me to the ground. I struggled to get free, but it was too strong. I was certain that I was going to die. Just as I thought it was over, the creature let out a final roar and ran off into the woods. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, trying to catch my breath. When I finally stood up, I knew I had to get out of there. I stumbled back to the park ranger, my mind racing with what had just happened. "You're insane," the park ranger said when I told him about the creature. "There's no such thing as dogmen," but I knew what I had seen. And from that day on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was lurking in the woods, waiting for its next victim. I never forgot about that encounter, and I never went back to that part of the forest again. I knew that some things were better left alone. I was a cop for about 5 years, and worked for a boss that used to tell this story all the time. Just a warning, this story contains self-harm, so don't read if that will trigger you. When he was a rookie and got his first car, they mostly walked back then. He patrolled his district and decided to check out this cemetery area. Kids often went back there as it was near a skate park to do extracurricular activities. As he drove up, he saw a person who had hung himself from a tree. He immediately called it in, and the scene was properly investigated. Well, the weird part is, the next night he became curious, so he went back to the same area. The tree was gone. The city had not put in any work orders to cut the tree. The city I worked for did not do that type of thing, as it cost money, and the city was too cheap. There was also no stump in the ground. There was no place the tree could have gone. He was in that spot for about 6 or so hours during the investigation, so he was familiar with it. It spooked him at the time. I used to be a park ranger at the Grand Canyon for 20 years. I've seen some pretty strange things in my time out in the wilderness, but nothing compares to the horror I encountered deep in the woods one summer. I was called to investigate the case of a young girl who went missing while on a hike. Her family and friends searched for days, but they couldn't find a trace of her. As a seasoned ranger, I decided to take a look for myself. I ventured deep into the woods, following the trail of the missing girl. After several hours of searching, I stumbled upon a gruesome sight. The body of the young girl lay in front of me, torn apart and bloody. I couldn't believe my eyes. The girl's body was mauled by something, and from the looks of it, it was something inhuman. I knew that I had to investigate this. I followed the trail of footprints and blood, trying to find the monster that killed the girl. The trail led me deeper into the woods until I reached a clearing, and there I saw it. The creature was unlike anything I had ever seen before. It stood on two legs like a man, but it had the head of a goat. It was covered in fur, and it had razor-sharp claws and fangs. The creature's eyes locked onto mine, and it grinned. It let out a screech that chilled me to the bone. I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move or speak. The creature continued to grin at me as if it knew something I didn't. It then turned around and fled into the woods. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. A part of me wanted to believe that I was hallucinating, but deep down I knew that the creature was real. I reported the incident to my superiors, but they didn't believe me. They thought I had lost my mind out in the wilderness, but I knew the truth. The creature, the goatman, was still out there lurking in the woods. It was waiting for its next victim. I shared my tale with my friends around the campfire. I saw a fear in their eyes. The forest that was once a place of joy now turned out to be a terrifying place. The goatman, it's still out there, and it's not done killing. I wanted to warn them to be careful, to not go too deep into the woods. But what's the use? Some creatures can't be stopped. All we can do is pray that they don't cross our path. So these two veteran cops, let's call them Bob and Mike, respond to a 911 that lacked details on a nicer block in the shit neighborhood of a large city. They get to the house and are met by this older woman who was clearly an immigrant from one of the Caribbean islands, judging by her accent. She welcomes them in and politely tells them that she didn't make the call and alluded to having had previous issues with some of the local punk kids, so they probably made the call as a prank. So Bob is not green by any standard and is pretty well educated for a cop. Super rational guy who has faced absolute nightmares with unflappable stoicism. But damned if there isn't something about that house that's telling him to run and not look back. And there's no reason for it. The house isn't a mansion, but it's clean and well kept. The woman is annoyed about the prank call, but entirely cordial with him. There's no weird sounds or smells that suggest something is amiss. Still, he can't shake this feeling of unbridled terror. They eventually finish taking the report and leave. After they get into the car, Mike looks at Bob and says, "Damned, I'm so glad to be out of there. Place freaked me the out of." Now, this worries Bob more because Mike, in addition to being a veteran cop with time in the homicide department, was also some veteran of an elite military unit. His name entirely escapes me at the moment, and all around badass. That they both were independently freaked out was bizarre. Still, it's a big city, and they have other stuff to worry about, so they get back to work. But leaving that feeling unaddressed didn't sit well with Bob. When he was on his own and had nothing pending, he went back to that neighborhood and found the block captain. Pro tip, if you want to know the details in a specific area, find the block captain. So he asked her, "Hey, you know that islander lady on your block?" The captain says, "Oh, you mean the witch." And Bob is just like, "What? Remember those kids that were giving the homeowner a hard time? Apparently one of the local punks threw a rock at her window not too long ago, before Bob and Mike visited. This shit, let's call him Punk, basically acted like an asshole prick when the woman confronted him. Witnesses say she swore he would regret it. That very night, Punk's parents rush him to the local hospital, which is actually a really phenomenal hospital despite the neighborhood. He's in massive pain for apparently no reason. The ER runs tests. He's in multiple organ failure, and they have no idea why. None of their tests showed any reason why a previously healthy teenager was just dying in front of them. Nothing poisonous, no injuries, etc. The staff valiantly worked to stabilize him, but nothing was working. At last, the parents went to the homeowner's place, throw themselves in front of her door, and beg her to spare their son. The homeowner supposedly looked at them with an oddly neutral face and said their son would be fine. Sure enough, for no reason that the hospital staff could fathom, Punk does a complete 180 during the night. All his organs start working again. He stabilizes and is back to 100% come morning. There isn't even any permanent damage to his previously imperiled organ. Bob later confirmed at least Punk's mysterious illness and equally astounding recovery. Bob's contact was totally creeped out when he told her about the homeowner. Edit: I'm seeing lots of critique on my writing. I wrote the post while having trouble sleeping, so I'm aware it's not exactly Shakespeare. However, I didn't make any of it up, and I trust the guy I heard it from. There's probably a sensible explanation that no one has figured out, but I'm confident that this happened. And even if you don't, it seems a little uncalled for to be a jerk to others commenting. This story came up when I asked Bob about the prevalence of people who believe in magic in urban neighborhoods after reading about it being a thing in Chicago. I was probably just 18. I had lived in the city my whole life, but had recently moved to the desert. I'm talking double-wide trailer, maybe 5 other people living within a mile or so around us. 140 acres of just nothing but sand and cactus. I was already freaked out because I was so used to the sounds of a big city, cars at all hours of the night, sirens. It was never quiet, and goddamn was it dark. Well, I was laying in the bed of a truck right outside the trailer on the phone with my girlfriend at the time, laying on my back looking straight up into the sky. It was lit up like a Christmas tree. My entire vision was just stars. It was fascinating. Well, while I'm on the phone, at the very right of my vision, I see something moving. I thought it was a shooting star. Nope, bright-ass light moving around fast, and not in a straight line. This thing was moving in random directions, like if you took the mouse on your computer and just moved it all over the screen. So I stopped talking on the phone. It got extremely quiet, like white noise quiet, while I'm staring at this light moving all around. Then as it gets to about center of my vision, it just stops. My heart started pounding. Then it broke into 2 separate lights, and they started to do the same weird random movements. No pattern at all. Then again they stopped, and I was waiting to see if they would split again. Nope. Boom, like rockets they zip out into different directions until they were out of my vision. I was completely frozen. I didn't even remember being on the phone anymore. I felt like a child acting that was too afraid to go into a dark room. Frozen. Eventually I snapped to and bolted into the house. I remember telling my family about it, and they completely dismissed it. I didn't go outside past the fence alone for a while. I worked graveyard shifts as an unarmed security guard. That's officer rent a cop to you, smartass. I've had the same post since starting with the company, now going on a year. It's in a fairly busy metropolitan area, but it's really quiet at night. There's a police station practically across the street, so I'm mostly just there to satisfy the insurance company or on the off chance someone's brazen enough to try to steal building materials. The main area of the project is an office building. There's a multi-level parking structure that's attached, also mid-construction. The rear of the property is bordered by a tall concrete wall, after which there's a busy highway running in parallel. One night, maybe a week or 2 after Thanksgiving, I was sitting in my car, deep into an especially long and depraved session of plague ants, during which I repeatedly killed off all of Earth's inhabitants. Through varied torturous and sadistic means, a thin layer of snow had already accumulated on my windshield since my last patrol. I couldn't really see out of it per se, but I had civilizations to neutralize. Being a good security guard is all about knowing your priorities. That all changed when something violently rattled my car. While I don't have a gun, I do keep nunchuku on me at all times. Blue belt in Kung Fu, thank you much. So I grabbed those and my Nebo O2 beam flashlight and jumped out of the car. I couldn't imagine what was responsible for the disturbance, but I assumed my field supervisor had something to do with it. He didn't have much of a sense of humor, but he made it a point to try and sneak up on unaware guards. He wasn't very good at it. It's weird, though I exit my car and there's no one in sight. There's a thin layer of snow on the ground, so footprints or tire tracks would have been an obvious giveaway. I was about to write it off as a weird environmental effect, but then it happened again. It didn't feel like a shaking thing when I was on my feet, though more like a high-amplitude current in the ground. Now I'm on high alert, so I switched to the emergency scanner app on my phone to see if they're getting any calls about an earthquake or explosion or something. There's no communication at all for a good 5 minutes. Then some run-of-the-mill chatter about a drunk driver on the other side of town. I'm a little spooked now, but rather than get back in the car, I decided to do my next patrol a little early. I knew there was nothing to worry about, but figured it would put my mind at ease to check the site for myself, just in case. I started by looking around the parking structure. There was only one accessible entrance, which my car was parked in front of, but squatters are a thing, and it was a cold night. Nothing. I still had one earbud in on the off chance that people started calling in. There's a domestic disturbance call, then silence. Then the rumbling comes back. The whole structure feels like it's wobbling. I just checked the last corner and decided to get the F out in case something decided to collapse. Just as I leave the garage, something in my periphery catches my attention. On top of the building there are a couple security lights, but one is completely obscured by a lift and construction materials. So when I tell you I saw the silhouette of a man on top of the building, understand that it's really just a silhouette. My paranoia is pretty peaked out at this point, which I factored into my assessment of the situation while taking no comfort from it whatsoever. I decided to grab my binoculars out of the car, which I felt confident would reveal the silhouette to be nothing more than heightened pareidolia and a stack of tuxfors. When I got back to the car, I'd just about lost my shit. There was an impression in the snow, like someone had laid across my hood. 2 handprints were melted into the windshield. No footprints or tire tracks except for the ones I knew without question I had made. I pulled out my smartphone, not really sure what I hoped to do with it, but you understand the impulse. It was off, battery dead. Before I got out of the car, the phone had been plugged in and was charging. Over 90% battery. I felt the rumble again, promptly got in the car after checking the back seat, obviously, and drove it to the other end of the site. If there were squatters there, I conceded victory. Either way, I never got any complaints from the foreman or my supervisors. I asked one of the other guards if he'd seen anything weird while working the post, and he just shrugged. I still have no idea what happened that night. So the guy that lives across from my parents, and who is basically a second father to me, is a fire investigator, and over the years I will go work fire scenes with him if he needs help. We've seen some pretty wild shit, which are some pretty fantastic stories for another time, but this one takes the cake. So we are on our way down to the scene, which was in Miami, and I was going over the reports to get a feel for what to expect, and kept references to an altar. And he said that the cops that had responded earlier told him to expect some real weird shit, but not to call them because none of it was actually illegal, because they already went over it all. So we get there and do a quick walk around the property, and the home itself is fine, but there is a smaller building at the back that is completely burnt out. So we knock on the door and go in and start talking to the owner, and before he tells us what happened, he asked if we could be sure to have an open mind and not judge him until we hear the whole story, so we both agree. He proceeds to tell us that he is a priest of some religion that many would refer to as part of the occult. It wasn't voodoo, and it wasn't Santeria. I don't remember the name, but I do distinctly remember him saying that you had to have a Catholic Baptist at birth to be a part of it. And when we asked him what started the fire, he told us that his enemies put a curse on him, and it was spirits that caused the fire. And we both try to keep a straight face and think, oh, that sounds super legit. And then we ask him if we can go check it out, and he says sure fine. Just be careful, because a lot of the things that weren't completely destroyed are irreplaceable. So we go into the backyard to go start checking out the structure and start using his 9 to search for accelerants, any flammable substances that could be used for arson. And his dog starts whimpering and will not go inside this building, which neither of us have ever seen. We manage to get the dog to go around the building and doesn't get any hits, so we put her away and go back and start looking ourselves. Well, the first thing I start finding are railroad spikes everywhere, which is a little strange, but nothing too crazy. Then I find an old shotgun, and I'm talking like real old. I don't know much about guns, but it looked like pre-World War I, and start thinking that's a little strange. Then we start finding the goat and chicken remains, which I know is used for voodoo and shit like that, and start getting real weirded out, and the guy I'm helping has even started to get the heebie-jeebies, and that is when shit hits the fan when we find a human skull. We immediately call the police detective back, and he says they know about it, but it wasn't illegal. I have no idea why, but we don't ask questions. According to homeowner, it belonged to one of his ancestors, and it was part of the ceremonies he does. Well, long story short, he couldn't find a reason for the fire to have started. Every idea I threw at him he debunked with the evidence. I forget why candles were ruled out, but they were. There was no electricity running to the back building, and it was one of the lowest things in the area, so it couldn't have been lightning. As we were leaving, this dude tells us that he feels terrible, that we were forced to enter an area with such terrible dark magic, so he gave us the ingredients and instructions needed to cast some sort of cleansing ritual that involved reading some prayer that he wrote down for us, and mixing something called aqua florida with white flower petals and then dumping it over our heads, which we promptly did as soon as we got back home. Hands down, one of the creepiest things I've ever experienced. I've worked as a park ranger for a little under 10 years, most of which I spent working at Yosemite National Park. Honestly, this job is pretty mundane most of the time, the most exciting things being random deer mutilations and teenage party sites. One day, however, I was doing my usual rounds and making sure everyone was out of the public facilities for the night. I was locking up the doors to the bathrooms when I heard what I thought was a little girl whispering. It was ever so faint, and if it wasn't such a still day, I wouldn't have heard it. I sat there for a moment and didn't hear anything further, so I started walking to where my truck was parked to make my way to my next stop. When I heard it again, a faint whisper of a little girl, I stopped and looked around and listened very closely. Yet again, I couldn't hear anything, nor could I see anything. Starting to feel a little creeped out, I quickly made my way to the truck and hopped in. I started the truck up and began to quickly take off when I saw it. A ghostly figure, what I can only describe as an emaciated female. She had long, pale limbs with a rubbery-looking skin. Her eyes were pitch black and her mouth gaped wide open, like her jaw was broken. I freaked the hell out and floored it out of there, like a bat out of hell. I didn't lock the gate for that area and got some serious the next day for it, but there was no way in hell I was going to face whatever ghost, demon, monster thing that was. I've never seen or heard anything like that since, and I really hope I never do again. This story has been told to me by my grandma, and it's common knowledge in the family, so I have no reason to disbelieve the story. So my granddad discovered in the Army he had a gift for hypnosis. Turns out I'm not bad at it either, but far from being a performer, so I guess it runs in the family, so much that by word of mouth he started to become semi-famous, and he was impressive enough to have a producer wanting to sign him for a tour. My granddad declined one, because he had a good enough career as it was too. because he was really tired after performing, so he didn't want to do this too often. After a while hypnotizing people, he tried on his sister. She started to have visions and even managed to help her husband to solve a few cases. He was a LIE inspector while under the spell of her brother. Now, here comes the craziest shit ever, and if it was not coming from my family, I would have thought it's pure BS. Once in a while, they had sessions with my granddad and her sister, just for discovery purposes, and to show off a bit, I guess. A doctor comes with his wife. When my grand-aunt is under hypnosis, she tells. This woman has a spot behind her eye, and her blood flows backwards. All start to laugh, especially the doctor, who was already thinking everything was best. And for a while, nobody cares. Until the woman gets a tumor in her eye, and when she was examined in the hospital, she turned out to have her heart on the right side, and pretty much every organ on the opposite from usual side. There are other crazy stories with my granddad and his sis, but not one crazier than this one. It was a dark and stormy night in Ozark National Park. Ranger Tom had been patrolling the park for hours, making sure that all of the campsites were secure and that there were no wild animals lurking around. As he walked along the trails, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He turned around several times, but there was never anyone there. It was as if someone was playing a trick on him, or worse, as if something malevolent was following him. Suddenly, Tom saw a shadow out of the corner of his eye. He spun around, trying to get a better look at what it was, but it was gone in an instant. He called out, hoping that it was just a fellow ranger or a hiker who was lost, but there was no response. Tom's heart began to race as he realized that whatever it was not human. He could feel the presence of something evil, something otherworldly. He knew he had to get out of there as fast as he could. He began to run, his feet pounding the ground as he tried to escape the unknown terror that was chasing him. He could feel it getting closer and closer, and its presence almost suffocating him. Just when he thought he was going to be caught, Tom stumbled and fell to the ground. He looked up, expecting to see the shadow figure standing over him, but it was gone. Breathless and shaken, Tom made his way back to the ranger station. He told his co-workers what had happened, but they didn't believe him. They laughed and told him he was imagining things, that the storm and the dark night had just played tricks on his mind. But Tom knew what he had seen. He knew that there was something sinister lurking in the park, and he vowed to find out what it was. He spent the rest of his career searching for the shadow figure, never giving up hope that one day he would uncover the truth. There was a time when I thought that my life would be boring and mundane. Every day I'd get up, go to work, and then come home and take a nice shower before going to bed. Then one day, that all changed. Right after my youngest daughter started high school, my wife got a job in another state, and we moved without much warning. And my daughter also changed school, so she wasn't around very often either. I remember how alone I felt until this day came when something called me from the darkness outside of town. It was about one eye. When, at first, I thought it was nothing more than a raccoon rummaging through the trash cans outside the house. Suddenly, from behind me, I appeared this very chiseled humanoid creature, standing well over 7 feet tall with matted black hair. I don't know what it was looking for, but I can tell you that I almost had a heart attack when it turned around to face me with these glowing eyes. After what felt like an eternity of standing there in complete shock at the sight of this thing, it looked to me for about 5 seconds before disappearing. I would consider this creature a chupacabra, and based on what I've seen online and how this creature looked. After this, I started drinking every night and didn't stop until years later when I finally moved back to my hometown. To this day, I still think about this creature often, wondering if he's still out there somewhere lurking in the darkness, just waiting for another unsuspecting victim to pounce upon. I believe that would have been me had I been maybe in my full uniform. I was off duty at the time, so who knows? It's signings like this that make me wonder if all my years as an officer in service have really gotten to me. Maybe change the way my brain feels and works. Maybe I've gathered hallucinogenic pills from everything I've gone through, because since then I've never seen anything quite like what I saw. But I can't help but feel that this was more than real, and I didn't just have a vision. This was real. This was something that actually happened to me. I feel like if I had my radio or weapon on me, I would have taken a shot at this thing. Could it have been a demon? I don't know. I'm really not sure exactly what this was. But he opened his door and got out too, and we both stood staring at this creature for several minutes. When he began to move away from us at incredible speed, I turned back towards the cruiser, only to realize that my partner was no longer there. I was about to radio for backup when I heard a scream coming from the woodline. Just then, more silence. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there where I was until backup had arrived. Once it did, we immediately set out into the woods to try and find my partner, who had been missing for nearly an hour at this point. It was dark and quiet, an uncomfortable silence that now settled over us as we searched desperately. Then I saw it, the most notable legend, the goat man darting through the trees several yards ahead of us. But after a few seconds it stopped, looking back at me like it knew I'd seen him. The only thing I could do was stand there in complete horror as this creature stared right back at me with its glowing eyes before it sought out to attack. Right before I felt his hands on me, my vision went black. I woke up to find myself strapped to a hospital bed with nobody else around. I've been here for the past few days now and haven't seen any of my fellow officers. I'm hoping to be released soon. The doctors are being very dodgy about it, saying they have more tests to run on me before they can sign me out. What could all of this mean, and where did my fellow officer go? Wildland firefighter, once around 2 a.m., on a smaller lightning fire that was only like a half acre. The crew and I were taking a break from mopping up, chasing hot spots. Then all of a sudden, above the next ridge, over probably about 1-2 miles, as the crow flies, we see a large orange glowing light slowly moving from east to west. Someone spots it and thinks it's a plane at low altitudes, possibly running infrared to search for fires not found in the day. But another points out that the lights aren't flashing, and something about planes being required to have 2 colors for identification. It could be a satellite, someone says. But it's orange and moving too slow. Also, it's too close to be in orbit. Then it just stops, holds above the ridge for a few minutes, and reverses direction west to east and pauses once more. It held for another few moments and then shot straight up onto space. Not like it changed its direction and headed north. I mean, this thing jumped vertically straight up and disappeared. I've never been so excited and scared at the same time. Back in 2011, me and my buddy were standing post on the outskirts of our landing zone in a small patrol boat in Afghanistan. So we were a bit undermanned, so we only had roughly 20 guys on the patrol boat itself. Since this was the case, we stood pretty heinous post hours and ran a skeleton crew throughout the majority of the deployment. On this particular night, me and my buddy were standing post at probably about midnight or 1 a.m. He comes over the radio and tells me to check a direction and distance with my NVGs. Now I look over and radio back saying negative. I have no visual of anything. He tells me to turn on my thermals and recheck. I swear to God there was a human-shaped figure out in the distance, but not moving. Just standing there. I switched back to my NVGs, and again, nothing was there. It was starting to make my hair stand up. We called up to the COC to check on the G-Boss camera, but they couldn't see anything. The camera is a much bigger camera, essentially, with thermal capability. For the record, I do not believe in paranormal or supernatural activity. Our post lasted about 6 hours, and that figure was there on our thermals, not moving the entire time. It wasn't until we got relieved that it disappeared. We just chalked it up to sleep deprivation, but it always stuck with me. That was one of a couple times that weird shit happened out in the sandbox. I was the deputy sheriff for 13 years, and the majority of that time I worked in a large jail with a big population. I was a team leader of the tactical response team that roamed the hallways and responded to all the emergencies that would arise. Not just fights, but medical emergencies too. We had a set of cells in the admissions area that were isolation cells for the inmates who just got there and were problems, either mentally or physically. Cell 3. I responded one night to a guy who took his pants off and tried hanging himself in the cell. He had a really good attempt and had to be rushed to the hospital. When we reviewed the camera footage to assist with our report, all you'd notice was him standing quietly in the cell for minutes looking at the camera. The camera glitches out, and when it comes back on, he's hanging himself. The next 3 days in the same cell, we had similar incidents. One guy was successful in bashing his head into the wall so hard it killed him. But every time we would watch the tapes, the guy would be standing there watching the camera mines before the attempt, and then the camera glitches. To this day, Cell 3 still freaks me out. Makes me think there was an entity in that cell causing people to kill themselves. Paramedic here. In the middle of the night, we got a call for cardiac arrest, so we respond and walk in with all our stuff, ready to do work. A little old lady answers the door. She is really upset and begging us to help, saying that there's a dead woman on her couch. We walk in and no one is there. She is so adamant that there's a dead woman in her apartment and that we need to help her. To give her peace of mind, we walk through the apartment with her, even checking closets and whatnot. But as we were opening closets, I half expected a body to fall out or to find something. We didn't find anything, but the lady was still really distressed. I spent the rest of the night expecting to go back there because something just felt really off, even though we didn't find anything. Cop here. I had another officer at work meet up with me right after a call he was on. He said an elderly lady was insisting someone was getting into her mobile home and stealing things and moving them around when she was asleep or not home. This is the standard MO for dementia calls. They will insist, but the facts don't add up, and after talking to them for a while, you start to realize they aren't all there. Well, she had called us before and was advised by the officer to take some measures to prevent it or disprove it, which she obliged. She screwed all her windows shut, changed the locks on the doors, and installed cameras inside. She even set an alarm with motion detectors in the house and slept in her locked bedroom where she could arm and disarm from there without leaving the bedroom. And she said they were still getting inside the home. So the first thing I think at this part of the story is that it has to be dementia, because how the hell would they get in now? That, or it's like those horror stories where a person is living in your attic. She has no attic, though, so that's out. Well, he reviews the video, and you can see her leave and lock the front door. Then, sure as shit, someone's hand can be seen in the edge of one of the frames inside the home. He said after seeing that he tore the place apart, inside and out. But there was no way in or out, no signs of forced entry, and nothing missing from the home. He said he ended up not taking a report because he couldn't figure out how to write one without saying it was a ghost. As a police officer, it's always odd when you come across someone in need of assistance. And it's someone that you know. On one such occasion, something so life-changing happened to me that I can never forget it. It often keeps me up at night. I spend late nights while the rest of the world has gone to sleep, wondering what's out there, and how much of this earth is still left to be discovered. Those can be lonely thoughts, and I don't wish it on my worst enemy. There is some truth to the saying that ignorance is bliss, and I think that most police officers would agree with me on that. One night I was driving through some of the quieter empty road that surrounded the town where I work. Our town is surrounded by large farmlands. I spotted my friend's truck on the side of the road with the hazards on. I immediately knew it was his truck because of the crude bumper sticker on the back. I stopped behind him and saw he was out of his truck, staring into the distance. I called to him and asked what was wrong. He said he'd hit an animal. He seemed quite shaken up. I walked to the front of the truck and saw there was quite a bit of damage. I asked him if he called a tow truck yet, and he simply shook his head. He kept staring into the distance. I went back to my car and arranged for a tow truck and called it in. Still, I could tell that something else was bothering him. I returned to him and naturally asked him where the animal went and what kind of animal it was. Then he shook his head again and just said, "That's just the thing. It was huge, and I hit it at full speed, and it took off into the field." At first I wondered if my friend had perhaps hit his head. I saw damage to his vehicle, and I knew that no animal could survive a hit that hard. "What do you mean?" I asked. He turned to face me, and he was as pale as a sheet. "I don't know what it was," he said, "but it was large and pale, and it seemed hardly disturbed at all when I hit it. It came out of nowhere." Despite the fact he was my best friend, and I should have just believed him, I decided to walk a distance of the road to see if I could find any injured animal or blood or anything at all. I found nothing. I went back to my friend, and he kind of looked at me with his told-you-so expression. Before I could say something, we heard a strange sound over to our left. I swung my flashlight in the direction of the sound. That's when we laid eyes on it. A large animal seemed to be limping away from us. And when I say large, I mean massive. Then the animal made weeping sounds like an injured dog, only it was much larger than any dog I know to exist, or knew to exist, I should say. "What is that?" I whispered. My friend only answered, "Told you, it's weird, man." Whatever it was, I felt more in danger than I ever have in my entire career. The creature stopped for a moment to lick its front paw. It was clearly injured. At that point, I took a step back, and a twig broke beneath my boot. I couldn't believe my eyes when the creature stood up on its hind legs and ran away from us. At that point, my friend and I were just completely silent from shock. I nudged him and motioned in the direction of my police vehicle. We waited there for the tow truck to arrive. The entire time we waited, we could hear the weeping combined with a weird, low-pitched growling sound. By the time the tow truck arrived, the sounds had almost completely disappeared. But it took all of my courage to get back out of the car. It was difficult to explain to the tow truck operator that there was no animal carcass, and in the end it was even more difficult for my friend to explain to his insurance. Thankfully, I was able to give a statement and help him out. I was nervous about giving my report when I got back to the office, but as it turns out, I'm not the only officer to have seen this creature. It makes me feel a little better to know that I'm not crazy. But still, I really wish I hadn't seen it. To this day, my friend refuses to drive along those roads again. He says he still has nightmares about it, wakes up sweating and stressed out. He and I don't talk about it much, but we were both really rattled. At the time of this encounter, I was a park ranger at a state park in Arkansas. The place was just gorgeous. Arkansas is known as the natural state since there's so much scenic beauty there. One of the main attractions are the waterfalls. Arkansas has about 300, and some of the best ones tend to be in more the remote and mountainous areas. Part of my job was to maintain the access points to these falls, in order to minimize risk for people coming to visit them. A lot of my days started really early. I would get on the trails first thing in the morning to check to see if there were any hindrances. Things happen like flooded creeks, quick mud, dangerous wildlife, etc. The rainy season runs from October to May. The best time to see the waterfalls is in the rainy season, since a lot of the falls go down to a trickle in the summer. So I was out there a lot in the wet weather. My job isn't for everyone. It involved a lot of isolation and rugged terrain. I was pretty much always wearing my steel-toed wading boots and carrying climbing tools and ropes and stuff like that. I enjoyed the isolation, though I've always been an introvert and never was hesitant to get out there alone. One morning I was headed to a pretty remote area that had been impacted by flooding and long-time water erosion. I needed to assess the damage. It had been closed to the public, and we wanted to make it accessible again. I got up before sunrise and drove out. When I got there, the road went from gravel to dirt. which is common in backwoods Arkansas. Eventually, the road became no longer recognizable because of some of the past mudslides and rock slides, and I had to park my truck and head into the blocked area on foot. There was quite a bit of destruction on the old road, and I had to bushwhack my way through a lot of spots. I eventually came up on a creek, so I knew I was on the right path. I never actually been to this waterfall before, and I was relying on GPS, so I was glad to see the creek. I had to wade through the flooded creek for a couple of miles or so. I was really surprised when I came across an old abandoned-looking vehicle next to the creek. It didn't have any license plates on it. The car was pretty beaten up as I got closer. I saw a lot of scratches on the metal and a smashed window on one side. The window that was shattered had some type of cloth on it, and there were dark splotches all over the interior. I didn't really want to know what those were from. Maybe fungus or blood. Next to the car looked like someone had made a campsite of some sort. There were some old cans and what looked like remnants of a campfire. There were large rocks around it resembling seats. I noticed that the rocks had a layer of dirt on top of them, and it formed this topsoil of sorts. That meant that the rocks had not been sat on in a long time. I wasn't even sure how long the road to this place had been closed. As far as I knew, it had never been opened since I've been hired for that area. It seemed that whatever had happened there had been quite a while ago, but that still doesn't ease your mind when you're in the pretty remote area, all alone. No matter how much you don't mind isolation. I kept going with my bushwhack machete, unsheathed in my flare gun at hand. At that point I was out of the creek and back up on the dirt road. I hadn't gone much further when I was assaulted by this horrendous smell of blood and rotten meat. It was what I imagined a slaughterhouse would smell like. It just came out of nowhere. I started to feel this creepy presence, and I slowed my walking way down and started scanning the landscape. When I looked past the creek, I saw a gigantic animal. It was crouched over this big deer carcass. My first thought that it was a gigantic wolf, but I knew there aren't any wolves in Arkansas, and this thing was bigger than any wolf could be. It looked like a werewolf, honestly. It was bent over the carcass eating. It had very long legs with very little fur on them. There was a huge mane around its neck, and its tail was really puffy. The head was unnaturally large, and the forearms were incredibly muscular. Seriously, if you try to bring up an image of a werewolf, that's the closest I can describe it. By some miracle, it didn't seem to know that I was there. I held my breath and backed away slowly. I felt like I was barely moving. It took a long time before I felt I was far enough away to turn around and make the long trek back to my truck. The whole way I was gripped by a fear more intense than I had ever felt. I had these wild thoughts going through my mind. Like, was that thing connected to the owner of that car? I didn't even want to imagine what might have happened. I notified the proper authorities about my finding of the car and sighting of the creature. I'm really not sure what measures they took to track it down, but the trail continues to be marked as off-limits to this day. I've told a few people about what I saw, but honestly, what are they supposed to think? None of them has ever come across such a thing. That's why I like to turn to your channel and reassure myself that I'm not alone. I was set out with my 9 police dog on a missing person case. Older gentleman, and it was a huge-ass ranch in Oklahoma. Started the track, and the dog lost it in the middle of a small, fenced-in pasture. The dog was telling me he should have been right there, but he wasn't. I called in another dog team since my mutt was seemingly playing games with me. The second dog went to the same spot. We half joked about aliens at that point, but we were both pretty baffled. His body was found a couple of days later in a small box canyon about a mile away, still on his land. Autopsy confirmed heart attack. Another call was to a 911 hang-up in a small office building in the middle of the night. We got a key holder out to let us in, and we checked it out. Nobody in there, so we had the key holder come in and make sure everything looked dark and that nobody had broken in. We took him to the office where the call originated, and he turned white as a sheet. The guy who used that office died of a heart attack the week prior. So anyhow, in my hometown there is an old hospital that's long since been retired since they built a new one nearly a decade ago. Well, to keep people out of it, they have cameras set up at the entrances and a few motion sensors in the hallways. No one is supposed to be in this place. No one. The building is owned by the city, and they currently aren't even using it for storage. They just keep the place in decent conditions in case they ever need to use it again. Apparently, according to my cop friend, almost weekly, at least once, occasionally twice a week. The cameras will pick up movement and follow something into the door, and then the motion sensors will go off in a pattern like someone is walking the halls and checking rooms. My friend gets set in to clear it one night. He's won the phone with the alarm company, and they send him to the second floor of this retired hospital to clear this building that's very creepy. And the alarm company is telling him the alarms on the floor he is on are going off, and he dead serious says, "Listen, I'm on the second floor currently, and there isn't anyone here." And a door halfway down the hallway just opened and closed. Oh, Fett did it. Out. Whatever the F is here can stay here. My partner's in the car. I'm noping the F out of this place. Several years back, me and my group of friends would regularly attend NASCAR races and camp out for the weekend. For anyone unfamiliar, it's a lively atmosphere with drinking and partying. Lots of tents and RV camping. On this particular trip, we wake up hungover and notice we're missing a member of the group. As we all take in our surroundings, we see a man pop out of a tent a good 50 meters away and beeline at our way. In his wake, a woman and several small children pop out of said tent. The woman's husband was in a different tent, and my friend had stumbled in their tent in a drunken haze and slept with the woman and her kids. After about an hour of hard stares, glares, and seeing the woman reassure her husband, nothing happened. We carried on with the weekend. But he will forever be in the wrong tent whenever we go camping. It was early one morning when I got the call. A woman said that there was someone staring at her through one of her living room windows. That's never good, and I quickly established that the woman lived alone. So I rushed over to her address. The first thing I did was walk around her house, hoping to catch the peeping Tom in action. I didn't find anybody, but what I did find were some canine tracks leading to and away from her window. I figured that whoever it was, they had a dog with them and made a note of that. Should we catch him, I don't want to be surprised by an aggressive dog. I hadn't noticed it at first, but my partner called me aside and pointed out that there were no human footprints, only dog tracks. It was odd, but I'm no expert in the field, so I just kind of chalked it up as weird and carried on with my job. I went inside to get the complaints report and sent my partner out to ask if the neighbors had any similar experiences or had seen anything. The lady explained to me that she was walking with her cup of coffee from the kitchen to the bedroom when she saw that someone was looking at her through the window. She said she screamed, but the person didn't seem bothered. Then she yelled at the person to leave because she was going to call the cops, and they still didn't move. She said that the person just smiled at her. She said she could see his breath on the window, and when I checked, I could see a mark where his hot breath had caused steam against the glass. She said that even when she was on the phone with police, the person didn't budge at all. It was only when she heard the sound of our car pull up in the driveway, she turned to look towards the front of the house. And when she turned back, the face was gone. Rightfully, she seemed pretty rattled. I would have felt the same. I took her statement and waited for my partner to come back. She said that the neighbors hadn't had any similar experiences, but one of them said she heard someone fiddling with her window a few nights before. We decided to check the house and make sure there was nowhere for the creep to come in. The woman said that she'd likely be staying with her parents that night because she was too creeped out to be in her own house. It was understandable. Then she asked if one of us could wait with her while she got ready and packed her bags, just in case the creep came back. I agreed, giving her a time limit as we were on duty, and I was supposed to be on patrol. While she was in the shower, my partner and I were talking it over, wondering if we should search the neighbor's yard, since the person could still be around. That's when my partner asked me if I could hear that sound. I listened, and it sounded like tapping on the glass. We ran into the living room, and there was a smiling face staring back at us. Only something was really wrong with the face. The smile seemed fixated, and the person had glowing eyes. Although the bottom of the window was shoulder height to us, the person seemed to be crouched down as if on hands and knees. My partner and I drew our weapons, and we ran out of the house, each of us running in opposite directions towards the back window. When I got there, I caught the end of it running away and over a fence. It was no person at all. What I saw was the large body of a dog, but with elongated limbs. It was like a human head had been attached to a greyhound's body. The creature took off over the wall with ease. I was shocked, stuck in place. That's when my partner pulled on my sleeve, saying that we had to follow it. We ran, and I helped her over the wall, but she quickly called back to me that we were too late. I went over to the neighbor, who let me into his backyard, and my partner immediately pointed out to me that there were only dog tracks. I felt dizzy at that point. How could I possibly explain this to anyone? "Did you see it too?" I asked. My partner gulped and nodded. She was starting to look pale. I know that if it wasn't for the fact that she had seen it too, nobody would have ever believed me. We went back, helped the complainant, and pack her things, and both me and my partner immediately requested a meeting with our supervisor. He took some convincing, but after both of us agreed that we'd even do a polygraph, he believed us, and we handed it over to animal control. I don't know what they're supposed to do about it, but I hope I never run into that thing again. My story doesn't involve all the creepy nature and stuff like that. Everything that I experienced happened inside one small room. One morning before my shift started, I arrived at work and immediately could tell something interesting had happened. Everyone was smiling and excited and talking in hushed tones, so I asked someone passing by what was going on. He just told me to head to the security offices and ask them there. Now, our park had a particularly extensive security system, and so there were entire rooms dedicated just to surveillance. As a park ranger, I didn't often go to those offices, so I wasn't entirely familiar with the way things worked there. That day when I arrived, I thought it was odd that all the offices were empty. Then I heard the sound of a group gasping. I followed the sound and found everyone crammed into one small security office, huddled around the screens. I kind of wiggled my way through the crowd and asked the man controlling the pause play button what was going on. "You've got to see this," he said in an excited tone. "I've never caught anything like this ever." He rewound the footage and pressed play. It seemed completely normal at first. I could see the small trail in the leaves of the nearby bushes moving softly in the wind. Then what looked like a bright white object flashed across the screen. The security guard turned to me and smiled widely. "Did you see it?" he asked proudly. I honestly didn't understand what the big deal was. It just looked like a bug or something had flown past him close to the camera, so that's what I told him. Then he shook his head. "A bug that close to the camera wouldn't have made a shadow on the ground," he said softly. Then he rewound the footage again and slowed it down. He moved the footage frame by frame so that I could see it happening really slowly. Whatever had come past the screen had moved so fast that even watching it slower was hard to make it out. Most of its body was a blur, but as it moved it became clear to me that it ran on 4 legs and had 2 massive saucer-like eyes. It moved with one lead foot ahead, much like a dog would. As I watched, I had almost forgotten that the footage had been slowed down. That is, until the security guard played it back to me in real time again. He explained to me that the figure was only on the screen for a fraction of a second, and that he had almost missed it. but was watching that particular screen because moments before, a group of antelope had come running past, as if they had been startled. He showed me the entire clip, and true to his word, a few antelope came galloping down the path, clearly under stress. Then a second later, the figure flashed past the screen. To my knowledge, there's no dog on earth that could possibly run that fast. A group of us went out to the path to see if we could find anything that could tell us more about the animal. But we found nothing. We could see the spoor that the antelope left behind, but it was as if the animal's feet had never touched the ground. We followed the antelope tracks trying to get a better idea of what might have happened. That's when we found the animal's victim. A large buck had been mutilated. Normally, a buck of that size would be taken down by multiple predators that worked together to get the job done. Normally, the neck of a buck would have some damage, as the predator usually goes straight for the neck. This buck, though, had no damage to its neck or head at all. In fact, it only had one wound. It was sliced open on its lower abdomen. What I found even more bizarre was the lack of blood. I mean, of course there was blood, but not nearly enough for an injury of that caliber. I went back to the security guard and asked if his security cameras picked up sound. He nodded, so I asked him to play the same footage, but with the sound up. I heard the antelope make a noise as if they were frightened. Then they come running past, followed shortly by the speeding animal. Then there's a thud. That's it. It was as if the animal didn't even have time to squeal before it was dead. That footage still haunts me, and every now and then I go back and ask them to play it for me again. They haven't caught any similar footage since, and most people have already forgotten about the incident. But every few months we find an animal dead with similar injuries, and I can't help but wonder. I pretty much grew up in the park system and was a ranger for 10 years in a row, from the ages of 18 to 28. I am now married and have 2 children. Also, having a degree in forest management, I know the parks of our nation like the back of my hand. I have worked at every job in the park, including maintenance, construction, enforcement, office duties, and of course management. I consider myself an expert in the outdoors, wilderness survival techniques, and tracking. I'm pretty familiar with all the animal, plant, and insect species within the park. I'm also an expert in wildlife and a keen observer. I have hiked and camped in the park for years, so I'm very familiar with all the legends and stories people talk about. However, over the years, I've been assigned to work in the mountains and forests of the parks. I was a backcountry ranger and a mountain ranger for several years as well. I've hiked, climbed, and camped almost every day. So back in 1997, I was a mountain ranger at the Grand Canyon. My job was to patrol the South Rim from the Desert View area to the South Cave Bob Trailhead at the bottom of the canyon. I was patrolling the area from the Hoppy House to the edge of the forest at the top of the rim. The South Rim is roughly 10 miles long, and I was assigned to cover the area from the house to the forest. This is an area of roughly 100 square miles of forest and rim. I was on foot and at a hike between 2 points. A backcountry patrol is usually a 3-day patrol. I would hike in, spend the night, and hike out. I had a map, a compass, and everything else needed for navigation, and a radio for communication with the rangers of the Grand Canyon Lodge. At the time, the park had radio repeaters at the top and bottom of the rim, so you could talk from the top to the bottom of the canyon. The conversation was by radio repeater and was a continual transmission. If you were up high, you could talk in here, but if you were down low, you cannot hear and talk. The repeater was mounted on the highest part of the rim to ensure the best coverage. The repeater was about up to 20 feet up a tree. I was hiking up the trail by the Grand Canyon Lodge. The weather was warm and sunny. The forest was brimming with wildlife. I was walking in the trail, and I had my radio in hand with my walkie-talkie radio to my ear. I was listening to the radio chatter, and at this point I noticed something large up in a tree that what I first thought was a crow. At first glance I assumed it was a crow, but the size was wrong. The sighting was brief and lasted maybe a second or two because I thought, what the heck is that thing? I looked at the tree and the crow, or whatever it was, and it made a quick but large flight from the top of the tree to the bottom. I had a weird feeling about it. I'm very familiar with the animal, insect, and bird species of this forest, but the animals in this forest have a set of tracks and signs that are unique. This, however, was much different. This was not a crow, but an animal that flew similar to a crow, and I kept thinking, what am I watching? What is this being? This bird was not a normal-sized bird, and I have never seen a black bird as big as this in my life, easily larger than a condor. I kept hiking up the trail, eventually making it to the top of the rim. I stayed up there as long as possible and began to hike down the trail to the bottom of the canyon. The trail down to the bottom of the canyon is a very long and difficult hike. I hiked down several miles in a very long day. There were people ahead of me and several people behind me hiking down the trail. There should have been hikers all over, though, that day. I always wonder if that creature had something to do with the lack of hikers that day, because there weren't near as many as there should have been. I told my supervisor about the strange bird I saw, but he couldn't identify it. It always stayed in my mind, and I never forget the strange feeling that I had when I saw it. I was always curious about it. I even tried to investigate the strange creature, but I could not find any information about it. In the end, I can't say for certain what it was that I saw that day, but I do know that it was not a normal bird, and it remains a mystery to me to this day. It's just a strange encounter that I've had on my many years working as a ranger in the park, but I continue to love and work in the park. I am passionate about my work, and all the experiences I've had in the outdoors, whether they're strange or not, have only made my connection to the natural world stronger. My name is Julia. I've scoured the internet to get some answers, but can't seem to find anything, and I'm really hoping that someone here might have some more information about this. It happened for the first time around the age of 15 or 16, and then once again when I was 20. The first time it occurred, I was outdoors. The second time, indoors. This will be important to the story. The first time I was with a friend hanging out in a wooded area. I'm not sure, but I'd say it was around 3-4 p.m., either in spring or early autumn. Not sure. The sun wasn't setting yet, however. It wasn't bright outside either. I can remember the sky being grayish. So I remember just hanging out with a friend, and all of a sudden in this spot, where the trees were less dense, I saw this static-like snowish effect right there. It was very subtle. The best way I can describe it is, imagine a mix of snow and white glitter falling in slow motion with the transparency turned down to 50%. It didn't fall from the sky. It didn't fall to the ground. It didn't come in sweeping from the sides or whatever. It just seemed like this large circular spot in the air where this static/snow appeared and began to slowly fall and fade towards the edges of the spot where it appeared. I asked my friend if she was seeing it too, and she did. We kinda stood there wondering, not really in shock or anything since it was so subtle and non-threatening. We just really didn't know what to make of it. Since the sky was gray and we were in a wooded area, I thought it's probably either moisture evaporating from the ground or falling from the sky or treetops. So to test my theory, I went to stand in the spot to check if I could feel or see any moisture on my skin. Absolutely nothing. The air didn't feel more moist, the rest of the area, and I didn't notice anything different. At a certain point, my friend just left because it was getting late. We never got an explanation, so for years I've just assumed that most likely it was just some strange but natural phenomenon. Fast forward a few years later, I'm attending one of my college classes. I need to describe the layout of the classroom quickly for this part to make sense. There were 3 vertical rows of tables where 2 students could be seated per table. Facing the left row, from my POV, was the teacher's table. My friend and I were seated at the first table of the right row. I had the seat at the right side of the table, my friend at the left side, meaning that Whenever I looked at the teacher, I could inevitably see my friend in the left corner of my sight. Well, excuse me if this sounds way more complicated than it is. Ick had attached photos to posts. I will attach a sketch later to visually show the layout. Anyways, we are sitting in class. I think we had an assignment or something that included reading and writing. Me and my friend had already finished whatever we were doing and were kind of waiting in silence for the rest of the class to finish. There was not much to do except just sit and look around. And in this boring and dull moment of waiting, all of a sudden, there it was again. This time I freaking froze. It appeared at the upper right corner of the room above the teacher, kind of right below the ceiling. Since we were inside, I could approximate its size better by comparing it to the walls/windows, etc. And I'd say it was around the size of a sphere with the diameter of 40-50 centimeters, 16-20 inches. The reason I froze was because, 1, my whole theory from years ago about this being evaporation or whatever natural phenomenon went straight out of the window. 2, speaking of windows, none of them were open in the classroom, so nothing like dust or whatever could flown into the room. 3, by looking at this static snow thing, because of my placement in the room, I could also see my friend at the same time. I saw his eyes widen, and him staring at the same corner of the room. Without him knowing, I saw it too, since he was slightly turned away from me, and so instantly I knew that he saw the same thing. A few moments later he turned to me, and I just nodded to him to let him know that he's not the only one seeing this. He just went back to staring at it. Mind you, this is a different person than the friend from the first story. Since most people were still writing or reading with their heads down, I'm not sure if anyone else in that classroom had seen it too. The teacher didn't notice anything either. Fair enough, though, since it was right above her. At a certain point, the phenomenon just kind of faded away. And for a second I need to interject, because as I'm writing all of this, I realize that it sounds like a bad science fiction story written by a 5-year-old Lowell. It's one of those stories that I probably wouldn't believe if I heard it from a stranger, but because I witnessed it myself and with other people, I know it's real. Back to the story. The class was over at some point, and me and my friend went through every possibility we could think of that might have caused it. Everything was a dead end. There were no vents near the spot where the thing appeared. All of the windows were closed. We didn't see the static snow seeping or falling from a certain spot. It wasn't smoke. It didn't rise from a certain point, and smoke is much denser and turns things behind it opaque. This phenomenon is really more like very transparent, glittery, static snow. It's not a projection since it has depth in it. That's why I keep describing it more like a sphere than a circle. It's threed. This happened around 2008, 2009, and I am just now telling the story. I am 56 years old now. I have told 2 people about this. I was on Telegraphford heading south towards Toledo, Ohio. I had just picked up my brother in LaSalle, Michigan. He is 2 years younger than me. I was driving and he was in the passenger seat. We had just passed a horse farm, and then there was a stretch of wooded area. Not thick woods, just quite a few trees. I was driving 55 miles per hour. Then something to the right of me caught my eye. I looked over to see my brother with a stunned look on his face staring out at this thing also. There was this thing in the woods, flying and keeping pace with us. My very first thought was it was a man with a jetpack flying. Then I realized it had wings. This thing was probably 7, 8 feet long and had huge wings. It was black in color. It was almost racing us, it seemed. It then turned its head and looked at us. Big red eyes. My brother and looked at each other. We didn't say anything for a few seconds. One of us said, "Did you see that?" And we both said, "WTF was that?" We looked back over and it was gone. I slowed down a bit and we kept looking but didn't see it. Just today I texted my brother and asked if he remembered this. He said yes, it haunts him and he doesn't tell anyone because they would call him crazy. That's how I feel. I have tried not thinking about it, telling myself it was a turkey vulture. It definitely was not. In other things, if my brother would have said no, I wouldn't be writing this. I am well respected in my community. I am an ordnance officer, and my daughter is a sheriff's deputy. Thank you for letting me tell my story finally. It is quite a relief. I tucked this away and never told anybody before. We live in Southern California east of Los Angeles, and this incident occurred in 1996. My wife and I were leaving home early this particular morning. It was still dark, as we were trying to get on the major highway near our home when we hit something coming out of a residential construction area. It ran extremely fast in front of the car. I had no time to stop, so I hit this thing. I came to a stop as soon as possible. I told my wife I was going to get out and take a look at what I hit. She begged me not to get out. I was sure that I had hit a dog. I stepped out, and as I rounded the car, the headlights of my car shone upon something that I'd never seen before. It was disturbing. I backed up a little bit, and I realized what I had hit wasn't a dog. I have owned and trained large dogs for most of my life, but nothing compared to the size of this thing. Nothing about it resembled what I would say was a domesticated canine. Everything about this was wild and bulky. It had what looked like a lion's mane. It had teeth that looked like it came out of a Hollywood horror movie. I can't even begin to describe the fright I had in seeing this thing. I backed up a bit more. I could see its teeth were unusually big and sharp, and there was a pool of blood forming underneath its mouth. Its eyes were open, but yet it wasn't moving. I could still see the bright amber eye color. My wife stepped out of the car and asked what it was. I said, I don't know. We got in. I backed up and drove around it. I said if it's still there when we get back home, we'll take a closer look. Later that day, when we got back, it was gone. A dried pool of blood was the only evidence that remained. To this day, we kept quiet about the incident. So, 26 years later, I now felt compelled to come forward. Not because I feel guilty about the experience, but because I had another unexplained sighting. We live in the same home as we did when the previous incident occurred. One evening, I was a few blocks away from my house, going through a house that I was getting ready to sell. I am a realtor and own a real estate business. When I was finished, I exited the front door of the house, walked to my car that was parked in the driveway, and got in. As I backed up into the street, I observed a large, upright beast cross behind me. I immediately stopped and looked out the passenger window. This creature was running on two legs in between the house and the neighbor's property. I sat in the car dumbfounded by what I just witnessed. Then I had a flashback to the incident in 1996. I quickly realized that this was either the same creature or something very similar. That was the last time I saw this creature. But now I realize that there is an unknown upright canine-like beast living in the area. Thinking back to the latest encounter, I estimate that it easily stood 8 feet in height, and it had a very human-like gait when it was running. I have read your posts about dogmen and upright canines, and I now believe that this is what I witnessed on both occasions. If I see it again, I will inform you. So I live in a small town in Utah near Skin, Walker Ranch, and tonight I woke up at exactly 3 a.m. and my room was 90 degrees, and before I woke up, I heard something talking and laughing. So I opened my eyes and saw nothing, and I kept hearing a popping sound in my ceiling directly above where my head was. Then I got the sudden urge to stick my head out my window, and I felt like I was going to die by doing that. But I still did it. Then about 20 minutes after I stuck my head out the window, I got an insanely bad headache and I started throwing up. Every time I try to sleep, something keeps waking me up, and my feet get super hot, and it felt like I had my feet over a fire. I don't know what's going on, and I just want to go back to sleep, but it won't let me. I'm the sheriff of a very small town that seems to only be getting smaller. With little means of income where I work, people are moving away to larger towns or cities in order to have a better life. It can be a blessing or a curse. On the one hand, it means my job becomes a little easier. On the other hand, it means I've had to let a lot of my officers go over the years, simply because the town doesn't need us all anymore. One of the things I like to do is drive past the outskirts of town. There are a lot of abandoned properties there, and I like to make sure that no dodgy business is going on there. Most of the time I find nothing, but one day I saw the door open to one of the properties. I pulled over and decided to check it out. I was fairly certain that it was just a matter of deteriorated locks, but one can never be too certain. Although they are abandoned, they still belong to someone, and I don't want them to be too damaged. I went into the house and immediately noticed a rather bad smell. It didn't smell like a dead body, luckily, but it smelled musty, like wet dog mixed with really sweaty human. Immediately I wondered if there wasn't someone squatting there. I called out to check if there was anyone in the house and got no answer. So I decided to search the house. It was an old house. There were wooden floors and the staircase was wooden. The wallpaper was peeling in the house and it was cold inside. It really would be the perfect scene for a ghost story. I was going from room to room, clearing each one. I felt kind of sad while I was doing it as I realized that there was still all the furniture from the previous residents left behind. It really looked as if they had thought they might come back someday. Eventually, when I had cleared all the rooms in the house, I just started to walk around looking at everything out of curiosity. My mind drifted wondering if I could track down the person that currently owned the house and let them know that they had a treasure trove of antiques that were simply collecting dust. I wasn't really concentrating all that much when I heard a door slam downstairs. I knew it was the front door, since it was much heavier than the rest, and the slam really rattled every window. I waited to hear the sound of footsteps on the wooden floor, but I heard nothing. So I walked up to the window that faced the front of the house and peered outside, hoping to catch someone walking away from the house. At that moment it clicked that I had never searched the basement. I stared through the window hoping to see a person, someone I could call out to and speak to. Instead, I saw what appeared to be a large wolf, only its features were completely different to that of a wolf. It was skinny as if it hadn't eaten in weeks. It was large and hunched over. It seemed to be grunting as it paced back and forth in front of the house. It seemed to be sniffing the plants and trees outside. At one point, it raised itself onto its hind legs and started to climb a tree. It climbed similarly to the way a cat does. Now, I know that most of you have seen dogs, and that means most of you know that they don't climb trees like that. Their bodies simply aren't built that way. I don't know what it was looking for, but it didn't find it and climbed back down the tree. The window was slightly dirty, so I was having a hard time making out the finer details of the creature. I knew it could easily overpower me, though, leaving me trapped in the house where it was clearly going in and out of. I decided to open the window to get a better look at it so that I could establish exactly how much danger I was in. But when I opened the window, it made a creaking sound. The animal swung its head up in my direction. It looked up at me with yellow eyes that seemed to be almost backlit. It wasn't really as if they were glowing, but they were definitely brighter than any eyes I've ever seen. I immediately matched it to the folklore descriptions of a skinwalker. My blood ran cold, and I didn't know what to do. Thankfully, the creature took off running, and I wasted no time hauling ass back to my patrol car. I sped off, and I've never searched the abandoned buildings alone again. Tade is a North Welsh for Granddad, so Grandma and Granddad are Nain and Tade on my dad's side. When I was very young, around 3-4 years old, we went to my Nain and Tade's wedding anniversary. It was held in a sort of social club venue in North Wales. All my older cousins and extended family were there, but because they were all a lot older than me, I mostly stood next to my mom, pregnant at the time with my younger brother, and my dad. Quick disclaimer. I don't remember a lot of this story now, just bits and bobs, so most of the story is from how my parents retell it. I remember this, though. My dad left me sat on top of the bar tabletop to go to the toilet. My mom was talking to Nain somewhere else, and I was a bit of a daddy's girl at that age, with my older girl cousins looking after me, but mainly speaking to each other. Then a man who looked like my dad came up to me. I remember he was fat with gray hair and slightly shorter than my dad. That's all I recall. The next part is how my dad remembers it. Apparently, when my dad came back, I told him how I met Real Tade. Apparently, Real Tide had a long conversation with me, asking me about what flavor ice cream I chose to eat. There was ice cream for young kids to eat instead of this alcoholic dessert, which I can't for the life of me remember the name of right now, and that he was adamant to make sure I knew that the Tade I knew of, the one who was celebrating his wedding anniversary with my name, was not my real Tade. He was. The next thing I remember is being in the car with my parents asking me lots of questions about it, like specifics about his appearance, what was said exactly, etc. The thing is, my dad's dad died of a stroke when he was 17. I never knew him. My dad had me when he was 43. There were no photos of him at my Nain's house, and my Nain was married to my stepdad for far longer than she had been married to Real Tade. Essentially, there is no way I would have known at that age that who I called Tade was not my blood relative. My dad is adamant that he never mentioned it in passing to me at all. The general consensus amongst all my family members is that Real Tade came to visit me to let me know that my Tade is not my blood relative, which has to be the most petty beyond the grave visit ever. My name is Larry, and I am a park ranger on the Appalachian Trail. I spend my days patrolling the vast wilderness, making sure that hikers and campers are safe, and that the natural beauty of the area is preserved for generations to come. But on one fateful day, my peaceful existence was forever shattered. It was a typical autumn afternoon. The leaves were turning golden, and the air was crisp. I was making my way down a narrow path deep in the woods when I heard a screech that sounded like a little girl. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately froze. The sound was coming from the direction of a nearby playing field, and I knew that I had to investigate. I started running towards the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety and fear that was creeping over me. It was as if something was haunting me, following me through the woods. But I couldn't let that stop me. I had to find out what was making that sound. When I finally reached the playing field, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. There was no sign of anyone or anything that could have made the noise. But then I heard the scream again, this time louder and more urgent. Without hesitation, I turned and ran towards the sound. As I made my way through the thick underbrush, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I was terrified, and I didn't know why, but I couldn't turn back now. I had to know what was making that sound. Finally, I reached a clearing where the scream had originated, and what I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my days. In the center of the clearing stood a creature unlike any I had ever seen before. It was a skinwalker, a creature of legend and nightmares. It was tall and thin, with long pointed ears and glowing red eyes. The skinwalker let out a screech and then disappeared before my very eyes. I was so frightened that I fell to the ground, unable to move. I lay there for what felt like hours, until finally I managed to pull myself to my feet and make my way back to civilization. But the damage had already been done. I was forever changed by that encounter in the woods. I couldn't shake the memory of the skinwalker from my mind, and I was consumed by fear and paranoia. I knew that I would never be the same again. In the end, I lost my job as a park ranger, and I became a recluse, living in fear of the skinwalker and the other creatures that lurk in the dark and twisted corners of the wilderness. I know that I will never be able to escape the terror of that fateful day, and I will always be haunted by the memory of the skinwalker. I'd love to tell you about an unsettling experience I had about 4 years ago in the fall. I was born in and still live in Lewisberry, Pennsylvania. My younger years were spent back near the old observatory, around Moore's Mountain Road and Observatory Drive. Even then I could sense that area was a little off. The woods were just not quite right. Open fields seemed eerie. The roads never seemed to go the exact places you thought they did. Moore's Mountain Church boasted Spook Hollow, which was a logging road that just kind of petered out, that reeked of being creepy. But let's get to the present. Most nights than not, I will drive down to New Cumberland for a cold beer and some darts, and one night in October 2012 was no different. On the return trip, not long after midnight, I was on Route 380, headed east towards Lewisberry. As I was approaching John Brenneman's place up on the right, just before Brenneman Drive, I saw someone walking towards me along the side of the road. True, it was late, but it was rather mild for October, so it wasn't out of the question that someone might be walking along the road. What was odd is that he was quite tall, 6'6" or taller, and really, really thin. In the few seconds I was looking at him, I noticed that he seemed to be dressed all in black, with black pants, a tight black trench coat, very, very dark skin, and short, dark hair. He was either limping or having trouble walking. As I debated slowing down, maybe someone had had an accident, he dropped down to all fours and quickly scampered across the road in front of me. He has a face that was, as I said, coal black, with a cross between human and keen face. And then he was gone. When I got home, I hadn't really thought much about it, but over the next day or two, it really started to give me the creeps. I didn't say anything to anyone for a few days, then told a few close friends. Being self-employed and fearing derision, I was reticent to make much ado about it, although I have always been an enthusiast of the paranormal cryptozoology. Ghosts and such, I have always been a dyed-in-the-wool skeptic. I can't explain what I saw or begin to postulate what it was. I only know I saw it, and it creeps me out. So as a teenager, my friends and I used to do all sorts of stupid things to scare each other, or to try and contact spirits, ghosts, and whatnot. If we saw it on TV, we tried to find it or summon it, to say the least. Yeah, no, the typical just messing around kind of things teenagers do. So one night we were out on my friend's pool deck behind his house. He has this 1-acre plot behind his place that is a small field. The grass was only grown up maybe a foot because it was just getting into spring and the snow had been gone. Maybe a month. We were just goofing off out back, and he was trying to spook my sister and I that he saw a big foot out back in the field. He said his mom saw it and had this whole elaborate story about how it was just chilling on his garden bench in his yard. After a while, he brought us down into the yard, and it was really dark by this time, to show us where he had seen it, and to sit in the bench and reenact the way this Bigfoot creature was sitting on this bench. We get down there, and he is showing us. Then we start to hear movement in the grass a little ways out. We were a little spooked because he was trying to scare us with the Bigfoot thing, but we all decided it was probably his cat kit, so we started calling to the cat, and the movement stopped. We brushed it off and went back up onto the back deck, and there is his cat at the back sliding door, just sitting there watching us. I got a little nervous, but they just laughed it off and said it was probably the neighbor's cat, which would explain why it didn't come over to us. We sat and chatted for a bit, then my sister and I decided we were going to go home because it was getting really late, and we didn't want to get in trouble. Just as we were getting up from the patio chairs, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye at the grass line near a skinny tree. I froze, seeing as I was already paranoid, and I got their attention. At first, they didn't see it until it moved, and you could see the gleam off its eyes from the deck light. At first, my sister thought it was a cat or a raccoon or something ducking in the grass. But as we all moved more the pickup and go inside, it moved slowly along the grass line. I hurried them to look, and there was another one coming up from behind another group of trees, and the one in the foreground of the grass, you could tell it wasn't a cat. It was hunched down and didn't have cat-like ears or tail. It did have a tail, though. It was thin. This thing was the size of a cat, though, but looked more like a reptile, but not really reptilian either. It's really hard to explain. The closest to a photo I've even seen is this one where there was a couple, I think, in a wedding photo under a tree, and the demon was in the tree. It actually reminds me of the popular Jersey devil photo, but not really, since mine didn't have ears or wings. Most people haven't heard of Worth County. That's because it's very small, and I'm one of the few police officers in that county. It's one of those places where people are a little too afraid to date each other because the chances that you're some kind of cousin is pretty big. Most days things are very quiet, although I'll admit we have some issues with drugs. Some people who are in recovery like to come out to the smaller counties to recover, thinking that moving away from the big city will help them heal. What they don't consider is that there's nothing to do. That can often lead to their addiction worsening instead of them recovering. We have one problem citizen who's a severe alcoholic. He's a young man, mid-30s, but he's been through a lot. Every now and then he drinks himself into a stupor, and we get phone calls about all sorts of strange things that he's imagined in his head. For instance, one time he called us to tell us that his neighbor was spying on him. He could see him in the kitchen. When we arrived, we discovered that the drunkard had thought his neighbor's house was his own, and he was sitting in the neighbor's living room. Most of the time, we throw them in the drunk tank and let him sleep it off. I'll be honest, I'd be relieved if he ever moves away. Sure would make this place a little quieter. Anyway, one night I was working alone, as I often do. It's a small enough population that it's okay for that to happen. The man called in, said there was something scratching on his front door. He sounded different that night, though. He wasn't slurring as much as he usually did when he called in. Made me feel kind of uneasy. But as is my duty, I had to go out and check it out. The uneasy feeling didn't go away, though, and I called my colleague asking her for a huge favor. She agreed that she'd meet me there, even though it was her night off. I suppose, as police officers, we never really get a night off. I arrived before my colleague, which was to be expected, as she still had to put on her uniform. The first thing I noticed when I approached the house was that there were, in fact, scratch marks all over his front door. So I slowed my pace and checked out the surrounding area. I couldn't see anything. I was largely looking for eyes that reflected the light in my flashlight. There was nothing, so I continued toward the door. The scratch marks looked pretty deep, and I did consider for a moment that he used a knife or something to carve them into the wood. I knocked on the door, and the man yelled for me that it was unlocked. It wasn't until I stepped through the doorway that I considered that it perhaps was a trap. He was a wild enough character to do something like that, but it was too late. He was already approaching me. His eyes were wide, and he was completely pale. I asked him what had happened, and he told me that he heard a loud bang on his roof, and that something had been scratching on the door. At that point, my colleague arrived, and I filled her in on everything he told me. She kind of had an unsettling look in her eye, and she pulled me aside. "He's completely sober," she said. When I looked back at him, I realized she was correct. What's worse, he looked completely terrified. I was on my way back to talk to him some more when there was another bang on the roof. "That's the same as last time." He said the color drained from his face. My colleague and I armed ourselves and walked slowly out of the house. It was pretty dark outside. He had very little lighting on the outside of his house, so we relied on our flashlights to help us see. We were still looking toward the roof when a loud thud sounded behind us. We spun around just in time to catch the back of a large creature as it scampered away. I don't know what it was, but it was about the size of a bear. Only it was thin and had no fur on it at all. We didn't move. We were completely unprepared for a creature of that size. When we were certain that it was gone, we called in animal control to search the area. They didn't find any creature, but they did find footprints, which they wasted no time casting. When I asked them about it, they explained that they were completely stumped. They showed me the castings of the footprints. The creature had large tracks that looked more like hands than paws or feet. Each finger had the longest talons I'd ever seen. It was truly terrifying that night, and the drunkard, he'd never had a sip of alcohol again. I've been working now as a ranger for roughly 7 years. I can say that I generally love my career choice. However, sometimes you have to deal with things that are a little unorthodox. Besides that, it's a pretty normal career, and if you're an outdoorsy person like I am, it can be a lot of fun. Besides all of that, I'm going to tell you about a sighting I had back in the spring of 2015 of what I thought was a large humanoid reptilian creature. I'd parked my work truck at the back of our visitors center parking lot, walking to the back of the lot to the edge of the woods. I noticed there was a small stream that was flowing down the hillside. I was going to see if I can get a closer look and possibly see some wildlife. It was about 10 p.m., but it was a pretty dark, clear night. The moon was not up that night, and the only light I had was from a very dim light from the back of the visitor center and from my flashlight. I stood there for a few moments, beginning to play with my flashlight, shining it randomly all throughout the woods. I looked down and saw that in the stream there was a flat rock that I could use to cross. As I was about halfway across, I heard rustling of something large. The first thought that crossed my mind was a deer, so I froze and listened. The rustling began to get closer and closer and turned into a loud crash into the trees, and I had a distinct feeling that whatever it was heading towards me. So I spun around and began to shine my light. There was nothing there, nothing that I could visibly see. I felt like I was being watched, like this thing was standing there just beyond the line of light, silently observing me. And at one point or another, I could see faintly glowing yellow eyes staring back at me with slits in them like a large lizard. Fear overtook my entire body, and I knew in that moment I had to get out of there now, retreating back to the lot. I've only ever heard other stories of similar sightings from other park rangers in other states, so who knows? And maybe it wasn't a reptilian creature. Maybe it was. Either way, it still really scared me. I just figured I'd wanted to share my encounter with you. I was a park ranger patrolling the Appalachian Trail on a routine hike. The trail was quiet and peaceful, the only sound the soft crunching of my boots on the dirt path. I was enjoying the beauty of the forest, the lush greens and the fresh air, until I noticed something odd. It was like something mysterious was hidden in the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I couldn't help but wonder what it could be, so I decided to go check it out. As I walked deeper into the woods, I came across a gruesome sight. Lying on the ground before me was the carcass of a dead bear. It was clearly killed by something large and powerful. I bent down to take a closer look and noticed the deep gashes on its body. It was a gruesome scene, but as a park ranger I had to investigate. As I was studying the bear, I heard a blood-curdling screech from a mile away. It was a loud, unearthly sound that sent shivers down my spine. I knew I had to investigate, but my heart was pounding with fear. I tried to remind myself that I was a trained ranger and that I was equipped to handle whatever was out there. I cautiously followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. As I walked deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around me, and the darkness deepened. Suddenly I saw movement up ahead. I stopped dead in my tracks, fear taking over. As I approached, I saw a creature unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was a crawler creature, its body low to the ground and covered in thick, matted fur. Its eyes were black and soulless, and it had a long, sharp tail that it used to drag itself forward. As it spotted me, it let out a hiss, revealing razor-sharp teeth. I panicked and turned to run, but the creature was quick. I could hear it getting closer, its hissing growing louder. I knew that if it caught me, I would be killed. I pushed myself to run faster, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran for what felt like miles until I finally stumbled upon a small clearing. I collapsed onto the ground, my chest heaving and my heart racing. I was safe for now, but I knew that the creature was still out there, somewhere in the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I waited for a moment, catching my breath, but the creature was nowhere in sight. It seemed to have vanished like it never existed. I knew it was best for me to get out of there and report back to my supervisor, but the memory of the creature, its eyes, its hiss, its teeth, it would stay with me for a long time. I knew that people would not believe me and would think of me as crazy, but I saw that creature and it was real. It was a nightmare that I'll never forget. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, somewhere in the woods, waiting for its next victim. From that moment on, I made sure to never go on a solo patrol again, and always go with my fellow rangers. But the memory of that creature would always haunt me. I was just finishing up my shift at the police station when the call came in. A park ranger from Jasper National Park reported a missing camper. I grabbed my gear and headed out to the park. The ranger met me at the entrance and gave me the coordinates of where the camper was last seen. We made our way deep into the forest, following a narrow trail that led us deeper and deeper into the wilderness. As we walked, the ranger filled me in on the details of the case. The missing camper was a young man, out on a solo camping trip. He had been due to check in with his family the day before, but never did. We soon came upon a clearing, and there in the center of it was the body of the missing camper. I approached the body and immediately knew something was off. The camper had strange marks on his body, as if he had been clawed or bitten. I surveyed the area around the body, trying to make sense of what had happened. The ranger was standing off to the side, looking pale and shaken. As I looked around, I saw something move in the trees. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then it moved again. It was a creature similar to a yeti. It was huge, covered in thick fur, and had glowing red eyes. It let out a deafening roar and charged towards me. I tried to defend myself, but it was too fast. It punched me in the chest, and I felt a sharp pain. Then everything went black. I woke up in a hospital room, confused and disoriented. The last thing I remembered was the creature attacking me in the forest. I tried to sit up, but the pain in my chest was too much. A nurse came in and helped me back down onto the bed. She told me that I had been found unconscious in the forest with no sign of the creature or the park ranger. I was terrified. I had no idea what had happened to the ranger or what that creature was. I knew that I had to get back out there and find out. I checked myself out of the hospital and headed back to the park. I searched the area where the camper's body had been found, but there was no sign of the creature or the ranger. I contacted my superiors and reported what had happened. They didn't believe me and thought that I had suffered some sort of trauma from the attack. They sent a team of scientists and rangers to investigate, but they found nothing. I knew that I couldn't rest until I found out what had happened. I kept searching, but the creature was nowhere to be found. Days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, but I never gave up my search. I knew that the creature was still out there, waiting for its next victim. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the creature was always one step ahead of me. I knew that I had to be careful, and that I couldn't let my guard down. I never did find the creature or the ranger, but I knew that it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. And I knew that one day it would come for me. I never believed in cryptids or any kind of creature that wasn't officially recognized by science. So when I received a 911 call from an old lady claiming to have seen a cryptid in her house, I figured it was just a prank or a case of dementia. But for amusement, I decided to check it out. I arrived at the old lady's apartment building, and as I walked up to her door, I could smell something strange in the air. It was a mix of mud, arson, and woods. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I tried to open it, but the doorknob broke off in my hand, so I decided to enter the apartment. The place was a mess. Furniture was overturned, and there was a thick layer of mud covering the floors. I called out to the old lady, but there was no answer. I began to check the rooms, and that's when I found her. She was lying on the floor, her face twisted in terror. It was clear that she had been dead for some time. I was about to call for backup when I heard a sound behind me. I turned just in time to see a creature tackle me from behind. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. It was small but muscular, with scaly skin and a long snout. Its eyes were glowing red, and it had sharp fangs that glinted in the dim light. It bit me on the shoulder, and I screamed in pain. I managed to push it off me and scramble to my feet. I reached for my gun, but it was gone. The creature was already running out of the apartment, and I knew I had to act fast if I wanted to survive. I barely made it out of the apartment alive. I was in a state of shock and had a concussion, but I was alive. I called for backup and reported the attack, but I knew deep down that no one would believe me. I had no proof, no weapon, and the only witness was a dead old lady. Days passed, and the department made a cover-up story about the old lady's death and my attack. They said it was a wild animal attack and that the creature was long gone. But I knew better. I knew that it was still out there, waiting for its next victim. I can't shake off the feeling of fear and paranoia that has taken hold of me since that day. I can't help but think that the creature is still out there, watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. I know I should have never doubted the old lady's story, but now it's too late. The creature has taken a piece of me, and I fear it will never let go. When I was approximately 13 or maybe 14 years old, 2003-2004, I went on a camping trip with my mother and stepfather and my 4 younger siblings. We were not a very well-off family. In fact, we were quite poor. I never went on holidays abroad, and we would always go camping, usually to the same campsite, which felt like miles away, but was in reality less than 10 miles from the city where we lived. We had been there a few times previously and knew the campsite and the surrounding area fairly well. It felt pretty safe and familiar. On this occasion, everything was going pretty normal. I hated camping. My parents would always argue when it came to putting up our tent. It was pretty boring being in the woods, and I would normally be the one entertaining my siblings. I hated not having electricity, access to proper toilets and showers, etc. It could be quite fun looking back, and I do treasure the memories I have with my stepdad, who is no longer with us. Usually we would go on long hikes or bike rides, with my stepdad using maps to charter our way to a small village, promising to get us all ice cream, which was a real treat as we never normally had it. On this camping trip we were going to go on a 10-mile bike ride. Both my parents had their own bikes, along with my sister and I. My stepdad's bike had the small trailer where my 3 younger siblings, all under the age of 5, were sat. It was hard work going on these epic long bike rides, but I rather enjoyed being in the middle of the woods, surrounded by nature. We weren't in the middle of nowhere, but it was remote enough for it to be inaccessible to public transport. Only forest ranger-type vehicles could access the roads. They weren't real roads paved with tarmac, more like dirt roads, which were really only suited for bicycles. During all the times we went camping, we never saw any other vehicles go down these roads. On this day we are all cycling down this road when suddenly we hear the sounds of a vehicle coming up slowly behind us. My stepdad is in front of us when he stops and tells us to move aside to let the vehicle come past. There's a sense of urgency and confusion in his tone as he's unsure why there's even a vehicle here. The vehicle passes us, and we are expecting to see a forest ranger vehicle. You know, like a 4x4 pickup or Land Rover type of vehicle. But instead, we see an estate/station wagon type of car with a long body and a large trunk with a window at the back. In the back of this station wagon, I see several large trash bags, and it's a very strange sight. I may only be a teenager, but this is a sight that sets off alarm bells for several reasons. This is not a car that is designed for going off-road in the woods. As previously mentioned, we have never encountered any vehicles down this bike road before. The person driving is clearly not lost, as they didn't stop to ask for directions. There are big black trash bags in the back of the car that look very suspicious. What I mean by this point, they are full and tied up very tightly. We could all see into the back of the car, and I didn't see anything poking out of the bag to indicate it was full of garbage. The driver looked very rough, and I don't mean to sound rude. He looked very mean. I can't recall his features, just that he didn't look like a friendly person that belonged in the countryside. He wore dark clothing. I think he was clean-shaven and had very short hair. I wish I remembered more about what this man looked like. As if this incident couldn't get any stranger, what took place next has left such an impression on me that I still recall the sense of fear that I felt at the time as I write this post. My palms are getting very sweaty and my heart is racing. The car drives on several more feet. Then the driver stops. For what feels like the longest time in my entire life, nothing happens. We're all just watching this car. My stepdad has told us to remain still. He's very serious as he's assessing the situation. Then the car's reverse light comes on, and the car starts reversing up to us. My stepdad, who was in the Army for several years and was one of the toughest guys I knew, goes into full-on panic mode. He tells us to run. We don't even get on our bicycles to ride. Instead, we all flee on foot, running with our bicycles through the woods until we find a railway bridge, which we had previously passed over. We never looked back. I have no idea if the man in the car got out to go after us. I don't know if he just continued driving. I have no idea who he was or what was in those bags. We never really spoke about what happened that day. I know it was something that seriously scared my stepdad because of his response, and it's left frightened about who I might encounter in the woods until this very day. This happened to a group of us after a deep jeep trip in the bush. Middle of winter, and we made it to the trail head. I was having issues with my quick disconnects from my sway bar as it became loose. I tried multiple tools to tighten, and they were too weak and would bend. After like 15-20 minutes, a random guy just walks out of nowhere, and he asks what the trouble was and had the exact tool to get it fixed. He was just hiking on his own kilometers in the middle of nowhere. We asked if he needed anything and told us he was fine and walked on. We drove back towards town, and I swear we never save a parked vehicle. Another time in the same area was on a camping trip with a friend. It is basically pitch black in the bush there as it's so far away from civilization. We went to bed about 11 p.m. In a short time later, we both saw a bright white light through the roof of our tents for a good couple of seconds. It was the brightest white light, and there was no sound, movement, etc. We eventually both fell asleep and left the next day. Even though this was probably 3 years back, I will think about it, and my friend and me will talk, and they will bring it up sometimes within a few days of my thoughts. To this day, we have no clue what it was. I have camped all over that area from 2014 to 2019, and that is the only time I saw something like that at night. The native part of the post above reminded me of a cross-country trip in the northern United States in about 1993 with my family. We were completely lost in South Dakota, and we were in the back roads with no sight of civilization. I think we were just trying to make it to a hotel. We were deep in the desert, and we basically losing hope of getting anywhere. All of a sudden, 2 native kids ride up on a dirt bike. They saw our van and asked if we were okay and needed help. My mom spoke to them and basically told them we were trying to get to town. She saw something in the younger one's hands and wondered what it was. The kid had a few handmade dream catchers, and my mom asked if she could possibly buy them. They were selling them, and my mom bought them both. The kids were very happy and gave us very solid directions to town. A.D. said before you go that way. Turn up ahead, and there is a native burial ground cemetery. It would be a good idea to visit before leaving. The kids went in the opposite direction, and we headed in the road they showed us, and we stopped at the cemetery and checked it out for a bit. We then made it to town. We had them dream catchers for years in our bedrooms. That was a nice way to get help. First time solo camping, young woman. I set up camp and I see the guy in the next space over just staring at me the whole time. I arrived a bit late and hastily tried to put up my broken tent. As the sun was setting, I tried waving at the guy, no wave back. I was awoken during the night to him yelling at whomever he was sharing his tent with. This was too far out for any cell service. As the sun came up, he was still yelling and cursing and having quite the unhappy conversation with whomever was in his tent. I unzipped my window a bit to watch and make sure that it didn't come to blows. Eventually, he came out of his tent, still yelling, and then began to take it down. No other person in sight. I realized that he actually had been alone and talking to himself the entire time. He had been making violent threats at someone he perceived to be there. He appeared to be suffering some type of mental breakdown. I hope he got the help he needed, but it made me realize I was just yards away from a situation that could have been very dangerous. The other strangest thing I heard was waking up to the sound of something very large smelling me through my tent on my first night. That really got my adrenaline going. It took off when it heard me unzipping my sleeping bag, but not before nearly collapsing my tent onto me by trying to lean on it. A camping trip with my class back in 6th grade. The boys were sleeping on bunk beds in a cabin. It was past 11 p.m., all dark. All of a sudden, I was woken up to a loud banging sound. Then I heard someone yelling. It was one of my close friends. He's the quiet kid in class who's also a very nice person. So it took me a while to recognize him. He started flipping tables, throwing chairs, and screaming like an animal. His eyes wide open. As he passed the windows, his eyes looked lifeless under the moonlight. To be frank, I was startled and very afraid. It felt like a demonic force was present in the cabin, and my friend was a victim chosen by the supernatural powers to conduct violence. The camp guides eventually grabbed him and removed him from the cabin, but the boys were all awake, still having no idea what just happened. Many were afraid. In the next morning, we found out that our friend had a sleepwalking episode, and through his mother, we found out that his sleepwalk episodes tend to be on the violent side. Needless to say, it was scary. It was something beyond my understanding, and when I stared into his eyes, the unknown stared back at me. To this day, I still remember those eyes, demonic, possessed, lifeless. I have a few. One I think of a lot is on my longest hike ever, 26 miles. At the end of the trail, there was a giant 90s computer monitor. I'm sure there's some way to strap it to your back or something, but the idea of carrying a big-ass monitor that long over that rough of terrain seems crazy to me. There wasn't any actual computer with it, so I don't know what the deal with that was. Another time, me and my friend were camping in an old mining ghost town, and a regular house cat started stalking us. This place has bears, wolves, and mountain lions, so we had no idea how this cat survived there so well. This one other place, there was an old abandoned car that every time we went there, it was flipped over again. It was on a hiking trail, too. A great blue heron rookery. Got in late car camping and set up camp in the dark. The next morning, around dawn, or just before we started hearing the most primal, guttural, alien noises I have ever heard in my life. It seriously sounded like something from Jurassic Park. I was frozen in my sleeping bag as I waited for what I could only assume was some hell beast to tear open my tent and eat me alive. Eventually I got up the nerve, read "had to pee," to get out of my tent, and I looked to find the noise only to see a bunch of big birds and their babies yapping away in the trees above. When I was a child somewhere in the late 90s and early 2000s, my cousin and I were playing on my swing set out in my backyard. Suddenly we heard some loud buzzing. I looked up to see what I can only describe as a tarantula, or tarantula-looking. I distinctly remember it was big and hairy, spider with big fly-like wings that had landed on the beam that the swing attaches to, which was directly above me, about 8,100 centimeters away. We both screamed our lungs out and quickly ran inside, causing a commotion. I have asked my cousin about it a few times in adulthood, whether she remembers this or not. She doesn't. However, now that I think about it, that makes sense because she wouldn't have been able to see the spider from her side of the two-seater swing seat we were on. The winged spider was on the side of the beam/bar facing me. She must have heard the loud buzzing and my fear/reaction and screamed knowing something was on the swing set. It's frustrating to know what I saw and be the only one who had seen it. I used to ask my uncle, who is a scientist, about the existence of flying spiders every now and then in my childhood and teens, describing what I had seen. He was interested, and I think he believed me, but would say there's no known animal of such. This was all before we had the internet or a computer in our household, so I couldn't Google search or anything. I was also too young to use the internet in general. I only realized within the last few months, I'm 29, the winged spider I had seen was considered a cryptid and wanted to document it on Reddit. I think this encounter is the reason I grew up so interested in the unknown, such as the paranormal, and believe experiencer stories from those who have seen weird creatures like ATs and Bigfoot, etc. I am aware that the winged spider I had seen is quite possibly an undiscovered animal species. This occurred in the western Sydney suburbs of northwestern Australia. I decided to go fishing in an inland bay last Sunday. It was probably about 50 degrees out, so I really didn't expect to catch anything. I just liked fishing. I made it to the bay around noon and got comfortable on the small public pier. I must have spent about an hour watching wildlife and keeping an eye on my fishing pole before I noticed anything strange. As I stared blankly at the murky bay, I noticed something strange in my peripheral. I swore, only a couple meters away, a silhouette standing there. It surprised me, so I snapped my head in that direction. Then it was gone. I'm fascinated by unusual things, so I'm familiar with the shadow person phenomenon. I'm also a fan of the movie John Dies at the End, and it gave me an idea. I thought that, if it was something real, I might be able to catch it in the corner of my eye before turning slowly to get a better view. I probably spent the next 45 minutes pacing back and forth at the end of the pier, checking my rod for bites and being careful not to look in the direction of where I thought I saw the shadow person. I saw nothing. I eventually got bored and gave up on my ghost hunt. Not much to talk about for a while after that, but around 3:40 I saw it again. That time I was a bit more prepared. I tried to keep it in my peripheral and slowly turn my attention toward it. It didn't work very well. It seemed to disappear again. I started to look around for things that could explain strange shapes in the corner of my eye. There was a trash can, but it was about 4 feet away from where I perceived the anomaly, and I was fully aware of the trash can the entire time. Other than that, there was a fishing line recycling receptacle a little closer to where I saw it. But it was paper white, and the thing I saw was a lot darker in color, and whatever it was appeared to be quite a bit taller than the trash can or the line recycling receptacle. So I tried again. I spent about 20 minutes pacing around on the pier and looking for whatever it could have been in the corner of my eye. I didn't see it again before I decided to pack up. It was getting late and the weather was taking a turn. It looked like rain, so I packed my things and split. Not far past the pier is a sidewalk. Then after the sidewalk is a boardwalk that goes over the marsh. The boardwalk is surrounded by tall grass. As I walked out and down the boardwalk, I noticed something else, unusual. The marsh grass near me, and only near me, was bending and moving. None of the tall grass in front of or behind me was moving at all. It wasn't windy at all. In fact, the lack of breeze had been bugging me all day. Shy fish seem to bite more often when it's breezy. It makes them feel safer from aerial predators in shallow water. I stopped to investigate. I wanted to see if my mind was playing tricks on me. I can buy my footsteps on the boardwalk moving a little as I passed through. But the movement in the grass was way too exaggerated. A lot of it moved. Not just a little. Anyway, once I stopped walking, the grass took a couple seconds to stop moving. I was definitely intrigued, but I had places to be. I just continued back to my truck. There is a giant mound of dirt in the middle of the public park, probably turf on top of trash. It was probably a landfill before, but there is a beautiful view of the bay from up there, and walking over the hill is pretty much a shortcut back to the parking lot as long as you have the leg strength. So that's the way I decided to go. Once I was on the top of the hill, I turned around to take another look at the bay before I left. And guess what was on the pier? That's right, a shadow person. It was about 200 yards away then, and being a modern person, I went for the phone in my pocket. But by the time I got to it, the specter was gone. I'm not saying that any of this is undeniable proof of anything. I'm just saying it was strange. Could have been my mind playing tricks on me, I guess. Hell, half of my platoon witnessed shadow people in Afghanistan, but not me. So I believe things like that are real, but probably relatively rare. I really can't say. I just know what I think I saw the other day. At least it adds a little mystery to my otherwise boring life. My park ranger patrol had become so sleepy that I began taking the liberty of spending the earliest part of it walking one of the shorter trails. It's technically not a bad thing to do. It just meant that I wouldn't be able to speed off to respond to any incidents right away. But I was coming up on week 6 without any kind of alert, so I began to relax my approach to things. And yes, Murphy's Law has a way of singling people like me out. I was at the point on the trail that was the furthest from my car, when I had heard a horrible shrieking that shattered the silence of the forest. I was torn between sprinting back to my car and just running to where the screaming seemed to be coming from. But when you're surrounded by trees like that, it's pretty impossible to gauge just how far away any sound is. I opted for doing the whole thing on foot, promising myself that I'd never leave my car behind again. The screaming continued, and I seemed to be zeroing in on it. But when I thought I was going to come up on a source, it would suddenly be another 15 seconds of running away. I wondered if I was having hearing issues, or if the acoustics of the forest were just so unfortunately arranged that screwed with my perceptions badly. But it kept happening. My urgency began to melt into suspicion. I did the worst thing that any park ranger could do in a situation like that, and I stopped chasing. Instead, I began creeping. I crept up through the tall grasses, ducking behind trees, trying to get as close to the noise as I could, before whatever it was could give me the slip again. It worked. Peering out from behind my tree, I saw something that was only vaguely human. From its head to its neck to its shoulders was a stretched membrane of skin that almost made it look like a nun's headwear, except it was skin. The whole thing was nude and seemed to be of the female persuasion. Its chest was flat and long and pendulous. The eyes were gaping and yellowed. The mouth was something else, and it stretched open, almost like it was distended, unhinged like a snake's jaw. In the unnaturally yawning cavity bellowed another plaintive cry of distress. The polarity of everything changed in that very moment. I was being deceived, but deceived into what I didn't know. I put one hand on my pistol just to be safe, and I began to back away from the direction I was heading. The creature, or whatever, swayed as if anxious. and it let out another longer, louder cry. I just kept backing up. This caused the creature to scream again, but not in distress. It was a hell of an enraged predator, deprived of a meal. It rocketed toward me, propelling itself through its strides with its knuckles, like that of a gorilla. In the time that it took me to bring my pistol up to an aiming position, the creature was close enough for me to spit on. Luck was on my side at the last possible second. My shot landed right between the eyes of it, and it face-planted hard into the ground. Here's the part that might get rejected from being read. I got ready to radio out and tell the office what I'd just experienced, but the body of the creature slowly crumbled into a pile of white pulsating embers that cooled off into gray ashes. I poked at the pile for bones or anything, but there was nothing left. I quickly told the main office that there was nothing wrong, and when they questioned me, I just told them off. I quickly dismissed anything and told them I didn't feel well, and then shortly afterwards I quit that job entirely. In late 2008, I came one night to find my mom sitting in the kitchen, all alone and in floods of tears. When I asked her what was wrong, her answer made my jaw drop. My dad had left her. There was absolutely no indication that anything was wrong with their marriage, or that he was remotely unhappy. But that afternoon, while I was out, he had apparently packed a few things into a suitcase, told her he was leaving, and just disappeared. I only mention this because it explains why my mom and little sister just didn't want to be in the house over Christmas and New Year. That kind of family-orientated time of year would just been way too hard on them, so they basically buggered off to Mexico for a month to just decompress or whatever. Point being, I was all alone for Christmas and New Year. Christmas Day sucked, and I realized they were seriously right about not wanting to be alone in the house at that time of year. So for New Year's Eve, I decided to throw a little get-together for me and a load of my mates, hoping that a little party might take away some of the sadness I felt as a result of my dad leaving. So on the night itself, it ends up being about 20 to 30 of us getting together in my parents' place, getting drunk, listening to music, playing Xbox, just a big hangout among some of the people I was closest to. It was a really good night to start off with, and it really did help take my mind off things for a little while. We did the whole New Year's countdown thing, set off a fireworks, generally having a brilliant little night together. But the drunker we all got, the messier things became, until it was just a medley of people throwing up, having sex in the spare bedroom, or arguing among themselves. Two of the people who ended up fighting were my mate Chris and his girlfriend at the time, a girl called Katie. From what I could gather, Katie thought Chris had been flirting with a mutual friend of ours and had taken issue with it. Chris was insisting they were just being friendly and it was nothing to worry about. But Katie was adamant that something was going on, that he was cheating on her. Blah, 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 you know how it is. Blah, 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 you know how it is. Teenage drama. Now I know Chris really did love her, so it wasn't like a stand-up argument. It was more like him begging her to see reason and to not go mad and dump him over some perceived bit of flirting. He swore he'd never do anything like that she was the only girl for him, how much he loved her, all this romantic, theatrical stuff that you might expect from two young lovers. It wasn't really any of my business, though, so me and the other party guests just sort of left them to it while we got on with trying to have fun. Then a little while later, I find Chris sitting in the back garden, swigging off a bottle of raw vodka on his own. I go up to him to ask if he's okay, only to find that he's crying rotten drunk, saying that Katie has dumped him and gone home. I tried to be a good friend and console him as best I could, saying that she was probably just drunk and over-emotional, and how there was a good chance they'd just get back together over the next couple of days when she realized she'd made a mistake. But he was insistent she was gone for good and they wouldn't be getting back together. All I could do was get him on his feet and hug it out with him. The poor guy really was in one hell of a state. I managed to convince him to hand over the vodka, drink some water, and then get some sleep in my bed so he could maybe sober up a wee bit before heading on home. He agrees I tuck him in and then leave him to get some rest. About an hour or so later, the party is winding down, and the remainder of us are just chilling in the TV room when someone goes off to use the toilet. They return like seconds later, saying someone's in the bathroom throwing up, then asking if they can go and take a piss in the back garden. Of course I tell them no. I didn't want them pissing all over my mom's flower beds, and that I'll nip upstairs to see if I can get whoever it is out of the bathroom. So I get the toilet upstairs, and I can hear someone gagging and retching on the other side of the locked door. My friend Julia joins me, a wee bit concerned, and starts trying to help me talk to the person who's locked themselves in the bathroom. It's sometime then that I notice that 2 doors are open, the first being my bedroom, the second being a little cupboard on the first floor landing. I check my bedroom and see that the bed is empty, so it's obviously Chris that's in the bathroom, puking his guts up because of all the vodka he drank. I shut the door to the bedroom, then go to close the door of the other room, which happened to be a little cupboard that my mom kept cleaning supplies in. My first thought was that Chris had opened up that door thinking it was the bathroom in his drunken haze, then legged it to the right bathroom in his desperation to puke. But I noticed something that, at first, I didn't really understand the significance of. The cleaning supplies that my mom usually kept all neat in a little plastic box were spilled all over the floor. Not like open fluid spilling out. They were just all out of the box, like someone had been rooting through them. As I'm wondering why someone would do something like that, Julia calls out that the person who'd locked themselves in the bathroom, presumably Chris, had gone quiet all of a sudden, and that they weren't responding. That's when I put 2 and 2 together. Violent vomiting, cleaning supplies missing, deep drunken depression. Chris was trying to kill himself. I absolutely pegged it to the bathroom door and started trying to kick the door off the hinges. Julia screams in shock at what I'm doing, and people from the living room start piling out towards the bottom of the stairs in utter confusion. I'd been really protective of the house all night, not wanting people smoking inside, not wanting people pissing anywhere they shouldn't, trying to stop spillages and all that. Then there I was, booting down my own bathroom door. It was way too heavy to actually kick off the hinges, but I did manage to kick a hole in the wood paneling, and that's when I got a look inside. Christ was lying there, a bottle of bleach next to him, and there was like pink puke all over the cistern, the floor, and his claws. It was pink because he drank the bleach and it had corroded or burned the inside of him so much that he had vomited up blood. We were distraught, terrified, almost sure he was dead, but we were damned quick to call an ambulance. Chris had his stomach pumped and he survived, but it took a long time for him to be back to normal. Because he puked, the fumes had damaged his lungs or something. I'm not a doctor, so don't have a go if I get the details wrong. So he had trouble eating, drinking, and breathing for at least a month after that. 12 years, and I've never forgotten that, and I'm pretty sure neither is he. Because as far as I know, Chris never drank vodka again, because if the smell of it makes me think of that night, God knows what horrible memories it brings back for him. I just got back from a week-long trip to Florida. My fiancée and I were visiting her parents, who own a home in Boca Raton, and I was hoping to get a fishing trip in with her father Jim while I was there. The Everglades aren't too far from where they live, and her dad owned a small boat. And since he's retired, he spends a good deal of time taking it out on some of the local lakes. I ran the idea of fishing the glades past him, and he seemed to be just as excited as me. Despite being in the vicinity, he had actually never fished it. Well, a few days after we got there, we made arrangements and set out early in the morning, towing his boat behind us. It wasn't one of the boats from the movies, with the big fans. It was a nice little 14-foot tracker, which was perfect for the narrow waterways. We're both kind of anti-technology YouTube videos, and computer solitaire is the extent of our interest. Select fools, neither one of us brought a satellite Jeeps, and we both left our phones in the truck. Anyway, we got to the glades and got the boat in the water around 9. We planned to fish around 2 and then head back home and be there in time for dinner. We hadn't planned on getting lost. It was a blast at first. We saw a few alligators, which I'd never seen in the wild. We stopped to fish a few times and even caught a few largemouths each. I guess around 1 p.m. when we figured we should start heading back in the direction we came. We were both adept at navigation and kept aware of when and where we had turned, but it didn't really help. We had seriously underestimated the labyrinth of channels and canals, and it didn't take us long to realize that we'd gotten lost in the maze of the Everglades. We weren't panicking yet, but by this time it was well past 2 p.m., and we couldn't tell if we'd made any progress or not. We had just come around the turn of yet another channel when I saw something bizarre. Something that had been standing along one of the banks dove into the water just as we made the turn. I only caught a glimpse of it, but it had been standing upright on 2 legs and had a green, scaly complexion. I convinced myself that it was just an alligator and maybe the sun had caught it at a weird angle. Besides, we had bigger problems. The sun was getting low in the sky and we hadn't seen a single other person. We didn't have much water and we were still completely lost. I really regret thinking I was macho enough to not need a GPS. A few canals later, I happened to turn around and caught sight of something in the water right behind the boat. It looked like an alligator, but it was moving way too fast and it was speeding directly towards me. I was in the back on the motor and I gunned the throttle in surprise response. A bunch of things happened at once. Not expecting the sudden shift in speed, my soon-to-be father-in-law fell back against the side of the boat and tumbled into the water. At the same time, the creature that had been tailing us rose out of the water and lashed out toward me with a set of razor-sharp claws. When I say rose, I mean stood up on 2 legs like a human would. Gunning the engine is probably what saved me, as the swipe fell short. I burst forward a few feet and got a good look at this thing. The water was around 5 feet deep there, and this thing was standing up the waterline around its waist. It had a pair of thickly muscled arms, each sporting one of those clawed fists that had almost decapitated me. Greenish-black scales ran the length of it and then terminated in a flat head, jaw open, bearing 2 rows of serrated teeth. I saw Jim hit the water and immediately start splashing around. I knew he could swim, but being launched from a boat into alligator-infested waters is probably the kind of thing to cause you to panic. The only problem was that this thing was between me and Jim. I couldn't leave him, and I couldn't get around this thing. There was no room. I'm not saying I'm brave, because I certainly didn't feel courageous in the moment. But I turned the boat around quickly, twisted the throttle as far as I could in charge. The bow of the boat lifted into the air. I couldn't see past it, but I felt an impact, and the boat shuddered, almost tipping to the left. I let go of the throttle and pulled alongside the frantic Jim and grabbed his arm. I started hauling him in and looked back over my shoulder. The wake from the short burst was lapping against both sides of the channel, in thick rings of water flowing away from where I guessed the creature had been. It was nowhere in sight. I brought Jim into the boat and not too gently threw him to the deck, plopped back down next to the motor, and sped away up the channel. We didn't see the creature again. After a few hours, we eventually ran into a group of guys who led us back to the boat ramp. We were only about 20 minutes away and had pretty much been going in circles the whole time. We each had about a dozen missed calls from our wives. I think Jim was pretty upset with me, but eventually he came around and laughed it off. He had never actually seen the thing and thought I had just overreacted to an alligator, but I know that it wasn't. Alligators don't stand on 2 feet and they don't attack with their claws. I don't know if it's a species of animal that hasn't been encountered yet or a weird human-alligator hybrid, but whatever it is, it probably shouldn't exist. I worked as a park ranger for a time in the Black Hills of South Dakota. My goal after graduating college with a degree in conservation was to work somewhere in the Rockies, but a job working the blackout wilderness came up and I took it. The Blackout Wilderness is home to Blackout Peak, formerly Harney Peak, and is the highest point of South Dakota. Fortunately, it's a very scenic and decently easy route to the top that most hikers can manage. Unfortunately, that meant a lot of tourists, and coupled with the fact that we were in Custer State Park, which is home to a couple of large bison herds that are easily spotted from the road. The tourists flocked there in droves. It wasn't that I hated the tourists. Wilderness areas need tourists for income. It was just that I had expected to work more with nature and less with people. Twice a week I was scheduled to patrol the watchtower at the top of the mountain. It was about 7 miles round trip, and I had to hike in. I loved it, getting up before the weekend warrior crowd, and hiking in as the sun rose. I lasted 2 years at that job before I found another one close by. Less tourists and more time in nature sounded perfect to me. I didn't have to warn families about the dangers of trying to pet bison anymore. I would be working for the Black Hills National Forest. Not quite the start of the Rockies yet, but I was moving in that direction. I was thrilled to be working there. I loved to be out in nature and seeing all sorts of wildlife. There was a lot of trail and road maintenance to be done my first summer. They were also working on a program monitoring populations of several wildlife species. So I was scheduled to be working outdoors in one way or another for practically the entire season. One task I had been working on was rerouting an access road and part of a hiking trail around an area that had been washed out by some unusually heavy rains. It was a big undertaking, so we had been working in teams to get it done by the end of the fall season. Normally, the teams consisted of 4 or 5 people at a time. But sometimes we were stuck working with just 1 or 2 others, depending on the other needs in the area. Things were going well with the project, so I was able to take a small vacation, 4 days hiking in the Rockies in Wyoming. The day I drove home from my trip, I swung by the forest. There were still at least an hour of daylight left, and I was curious to see how far the rest of the crew got on the project. I don't know why, I just didn't wait until morning when I came into work. I should have waited until morning. I went down the old access road, and it looked like they had taken down several more trees to make a larger parking area. I saw something move in the underbrush at the edge of the forest. I stopped my car and turned the radio down. It looked like something large, maybe an elk or a bear. I couldn't quite tell. The sun was setting quickly. I thought I had more time than that, but night comes early in the mountains, and has a hard time getting through the trees if you're in the woods. I waited in my car to see if I could get a better look at the animal. I knew if I got out, I would likely scare it away. Out of nowhere, I heard a loud crash and a tree topple over right next to my car. It was insane. The whole car shook when it fell. I couldn't believe the odds or how lucky I was that it didn't crush me. I got out of the car and took a look at the fallen tree. It looked healthy, no signs of decay. It didn't come up at the roots, but rather looked like it just broke off and fell. See, the whole thing was strange, but I was tired from my trip and just wanted to get back home. I was about to get back into my car when I heard another tree break apart and fall. It landed just a few feet away from the previous one. At this point, I didn't know what was going on. If a third tree fell, it would probably land right on me. I knew I had to get out of there. I had to turn the car around and maneuver around the fallen trees. And then I saw it standing there in the forest. The creature was knocking down the trees. I saw its eyes shine in my headlights. They were gold. I would guess it had to stand between 8 or 9 feet tall. Its whole body was covered in hair, like an ape or some similar animal. Saying it looked like Bigfoot or Sasquatch makes me sound like a crazy person, but that's really the only thing that it could have been. I don't know what else out there looks like that. It definitely wasn't a bear. It had these human hands and just thick hair all over its body. I didn't stick around long after that. It started shaking another tree, and I drove out of there. There were 3 trees down when the team got there for work the next day. I ended up telling my coworkers about this, but they just thought I was crazy. I live in Alberta, Canada. This story takes place back in June of 2015. I was 28 years old, and my fiancée was 32. I will call him Kay for this story. It was going to be a very hot day, for we had just purchased our first car after years of taking public transit and decided to go for an overnight trip to Jasper Park. To anyone who does not know, Jasper Park is a beautiful stretch of highway that runs through the foothills into the Rockies, right around where, I'm not sure what it is like in other countries, but here in the parks and wooded areas, it is not uncommon for people to pull off on the side of the highway and hike into areas for day trips, or even to camp to avoid the overcrowded campgrounds. We had been on the road for about 4 hours, and I was starting to feel cramped when we came to an area with a beautiful glacier river running next to the highway. So we decided to pull off the road onto an old maintenance road that ran down to what we thought was the train tracks that ran parallel to the road. The road was extremely overgrown and had railroad ties sticking up vertically about 2 feet out of the ground in an attempt to block the road permanently, but they were spaced apart enough for a very small vehicle to get through. Well, our new car happened to be one of those tiny economy class cars, so we decided to try and fit past the barrier. So Kay got out and directed me through the small opening in between the posts. And to my surprise, we fit. He decided it would be best for him to walk in front of me and lead me through the overgrown path while I crept the car forward in case there were any rocks or stumps that could damage the very low undercarriage of our new car. After about 15 feet into the road, the grass suddenly became taller than my car, and the trees thick and brushing against the roof, and the path was dark with light at the end that indicated a clearing. Basically, it looked like something out of one of those really corny camping horror movies. But we decided to go forward and came upon a clear-cut line. These lines are cut out by the government as survey and gas lines. Anyways, we went about 50 feet into the clearing that was surrounded by thick trees on all sides. After finding a flattish area where we could set up a makeshift camp, Kay decided to go and try and find where the river ran closest so we could go stick our feet in and cool down. I voiced concern about the bears in the area and wanted to keep the bear spray with me, so he took his wood axe with him. Side note, people do not have guns other than hunting rifles due to our gun laws. And due to this, we did not have anything other than bear spray, pocket knives, and an axe for potential defense. I decided to start digging out our tent to look for a spot to set it up for the night. Kay was gone for about 5 minutes when I heard what looked like another vehicle close by. I did not think anything of it at the time, thinking who else could possibly fit their car through there. So I brushed it off and continued what I was doing, but at the same time moved my can of bear spray out of the backpack to just inside of my trunk, where I could grab it in a matter of seconds. Just in case, right. After another minute or so, I just happened to look in the direction of road that led us into the clearing. And to my surprise, I see a man walking towards me. He looked about 35, 40 years old, with a bald cap and dirty blue reflective coveralls on. You know the ones you see the oil rig guys wear. After the complete shock of seeing someone, I started to notice. I could not see his face that well, but he had on a ball cap and shades with a scruffy beard. He was walking directly towards me with his hands in his pockets. I started to panic a little and immediately called out for Kay and for him to get back here. I hear him yell something, but I refused to take my eyes off the stranger, who is now less than 20 feet away from me. Now, I should mention that the area is known for hunting, but it was not the season. He reaches me and stops about 5 feet away, and me being the friendly person I am, I smile and say hi. Did not expect to see anyone here. He looks at me from head to toe and stands there for what feels like forever, and then says, hello, what brings you here? His tone very blank and not giving anything away. I say my fiancée and I were just looking for a place to pop the tent for the night. He freezes at the mention of my fiancée. He looks around as he hears Key coming through the woods to the right of us. The stranger, still gawking at me, does not move as Key comes out of the tree line with his axe propped up on his shoulder. Kay looks at me and then the stranger and immediately speed walks to my side, and being the cautious, overly protective guy, he just says, "Hey man, is there something I can help you with?" "No, was just checking my trail cams." The guy then looks at Kay, assessing him and glaring at his axe. I ask him, "Oh, so you know the area. Do you know if it's okay for us to camp here for the night?" He looks directly at me and says, "Yeah, as long as you do not have a fire or anything, and once in a while service trucks come down here to survey." Me, "Thanks for the heads up." I smile. He will not stop looking at me at this point. Kay sees this and decides he has had enough and says again, "Is there something you needed?" The guy finally stops looking at me long enough to answer, "I was in here checking my trail cams and got a flat on my Jeep." He indicates the bumper of his Jeep that is just visible through the brush. He continues, "I tried to change to my spare, but I have custom wheels and cannot get the nuts off with the tools I have. Now everyone in Alberta knows that guys with custom trucks are go off. Roading always carry the proper tools, alarm on, and Kay and I walk closer to get a better view of his vehicle and note that it is one of those jacked up off-road Jeeps with the engine snorkel and everything. I remember the alarms going off in my head, yelling at me that this is weird. Even I carry the tools needed to switch out my tires. At this point, I notice his Jeep is blocking the only entrance into the clearing. I proceed to say, "Sorry, but as you can tell, I only have a small car, and my tire iron is only big enough to fit the nuts for my 15 wheels on my car. I don't think we will be able to help you." The guy starts to look annoyed as Kay and I start to move back to our car. The guy follows us back to our car, then says, "Well, could she possibly give me a lift to Jasper to get help?" I immediately start to panic and say, "Well, my car is packed to roof with our camping gear. I am one of those overpackers that has something for every situation. I am not unloading all my stuff and leaving it here in the woods." The guy starts to get agitated, shifting back and forth in place. He then says it would only be a couple hours and your finest can stay here with your stuff then. I am about to say no when Kay says very plainly I'm not letting her drive alone with you and leave me here in the woods. The guy looks at Kay and says, "Please, I just need a ride into town, or at least to somewhere where I can get cell reception." Note, there is no reception in most of Jasper Park unless you have a booster or satellite phone. Even then, it's patchy service. And the closest town is Jasper itself, which at this point was 2 hours away. He continues to try and get me to drive him by myself for another 5 minutes before we both get visibly irritated. Kay then says as calmly as he can, "Sorry, man, you're going to have to walk out to the road and hail someone down." Now the guy is mad and takes one last look at me and then turns around and walks towards the road. After he is out of sight, Kay and I immediately pack up the car and start to turn around and head for the clearing entrance. As we pull up to where his Jeep is blocking the access to the road, both Kay and I get out and investigate his Jeep. He did not have a flat. There was nothing wrong with his Jeep at all. Kay decides to look in the back seat through the tinted windows. He all of a sudden panics and says we need to get out of here. I do not question him and get in the driver's seat while Kay takes his axe and clears away the brush on the side of where his Jeep is blocking the exit. After about 10 minutes of pulling weeds, branched, and rocks, we make a space big enough to creep through. It takes us an additional 5 minutes to creep through the overgrown access back out to the highway. As we are pulling up onto the highway, we can see the creep down a ways hitchhiking. Key says just drive in the opposite direction. So we drive for about 15 minutes and decide to double back and see if he was still there. As we come up to access again, we notice he is no longer on the side of the road. So we pull into the access road again where the makeshift barrier was, and immediately notice his Jeep is gone. Creaks out, and we back out of there and drive 5 minutes up the highway to a new spot. We find a nice calm area directly next to the highway where we can access the river. We hang out for a couple hours while all the time keeping an eye out for the creepy guy. We kept hearing twigs snapping behind us in the overgrowth, but due to the events that day, decided to err on the side of caution and not go investigate. I finally start to relax a little bit and just enjoy the sweltering heat. Around 6 p.m. it was starting to get dark because of the mountains blocking the sun, so Kay decides it's time to pack up and leave. I remind him that I had a couple beers while sitting at the river, so I needed to nap before we could go anywhere. He agrees, and we go and sit in the car, which we had parked on a little makeshift rest area. We hunker down, and I try to doze off. Suddenly, Kay jerks up and says, "Did you hear that?" I, still somewhat groggy from just passing out, "No." "What's going on?" Kay, quiet. By this time, it is pitch black all around us. All of a sudden, I hear it, the crunch of gravel and twigs, as if someone is walking in wide circles around us. We look at each other and then hear it again, this time closer and to the front of the car. I squint as hard as I can and then immediately turn the key and turn on the lights. To our surprise, there is no one there. Without saying anything, I decided I had rested enough and my adrenaline was coursing through me. I turned the engine over and threw the car into reverse and headed back down the highway towards home. After about 20 minutes of nerve-wrenching silence and constantly checking our mirrors to see if anyone was following us, I break the silence and ask the question that has been bugging me. "So now that we are out of there, what was in the back seat of his Jeep that made you freak out so bad?" Kay looks at me, worry etched on his face. Not normal for him at all. Takes a deep breath and says it was hard to see due to the tint, but I could make out a hunting rifle, which is not out of the ordinary here, but most disturbing was a roll of duct tape, rope, and a tarp. After seeing that, Kay freaked out, realizing this guy wanted more than just a ride from me. I know this may not be scary to most people, but to me this was one of 2 terrifying events in my life. This has not stopped us from going and enjoying the beauty of nature in the Canadian Rockies, but to the creepy guy who lied about his flat tire to try and get me alone in the middle of nowhere, let us never meet again. I've always been skeptical on the paranormal, but this event rattled me. I can tell what's going on around me when people are nearby, even though I cannot see them. It's weird. I guess it's a sixth sense, and it can be a gift and curse. A couple months ago, I was living life normally, and I've never had any problems with sleeping. I am borderline narcoleptic because it seemed like I could never get enough sleep and always wanted to sleep. I'm a pretty deep sleeper as well, so yet again, I don't have trouble sleeping. Next to my bed, I have a jacket rack. It has about 1 jacket on it in this decoration. The decoration on the jacket rack is an aluminum cartoon-like dress. The dress is 2, by the way. If you grab the dress and bang it up against the post of the jacket hanger, it makes a very distinct noise. I am quite paranoid and jumpy a lot, so having the side my head lays against the wall doesn't help because I'm exposed from both left and right. On the right is the jacket hanger. On the other side is my nightstand. The wall is slanted because my room must have been a storage room or something like that. There is a window area along the wall that is carved out and bulged from the outside. My large pillows laid in that caved-out area since my bed had them for decoration when it's made up. So normally I go to bed and sleep at around 10 p.m. I'm not sure when it was that night, at about 4 a.m. or so. I hear what sound like a soda can rattling as if you were clinking the bottom in a circular wrist motion on a wood surface. It was weird because the sound sounded like it was coming from behind the nightstand, nearly behind the tiny gap between my bed and the wall. Something to mention as I was collecting Sprite cans to make something with them. I was facing the jacket hanger. I thought the can was part of my dream, but that thought quickly went away. Not long after, the sound of the aluminum dress started to join in on whatever strange harmony the can was doing. Now the dress only bangs when my ceiling fans are both on high. Even then, it is super light. That night I had one fan on low, the other off. The fan that was on was far away from me, so it couldn't even touch the dress. To make it worse, it wasn't even light clinking like normal. It sounded like full-on aggressive banging. I thought for a minute, which made me freeze in absolute fear. Another thing to note, it had been almost a year since I had broke up with my psycho ex. We had dated online. Yes, I know, sad. In the 2 years we dated, we had met in person 4 times since we lived 2 hours away. 2 of the times we met, it was at my house. We are both minors and can't drive. When I broke up with him in January 2020, he had a horrible mental breakdown. It did not make it better when I got with my crush, one of his best friends. I felt so happy with my new boyfriend. I still am, and we're still dating. I wanted to feel bad, but he was so abusive and would threaten self-harm. I tend to try to be friends with my exes because all of them had been good friends before, so usually I stayed neutral. After a while in March, he contacted me and we caught up. He confessed that he was so mad he wanted to kidnap me to keep me all to himself. I was kind of scared, but brushed it off. I don't remember how, but we became enemies again. I was uneasy for a while after because of what he said. Because of this incident, that was the first thing I thought of. I just thought, well, today's the day, because I wasn't scared to fight, but it still shook me up. My blood ran cold, and the banging and clanking started to become deafening. Eventually, I got uncomfortable and turned over very stiffly and slowly. As soon as I went to shut my eyes, I saw something. I opened my eyes, and in the carve-out where the pillows were was a figure. I had to do a double take, more like closing my eyes hard and opening them wide again. With my elbow propping up my half-laying-down body, my heart simultaneously sank and stopped at the sight. It felt like I couldn't breathe. I slowly ended up lowering my body back down on my side. The figure had half a body cutting off above the hips. The figure was wearing a black tux and black button up, or so I thought, because of the darkness. The arms were in a position as if to adjust a bow tie. The head was the oddest of all. It was shaped like a plague doctor's mask. But the back was more pointed, and overall the head looked like a right triangle or a scalene triangle. The head didn't have barely any definition of facial features, just some depth like the plague doctor masks you see everywhere. But like I said, the shape was way different. It had no eyes, no mouth, nothing. It looked like Pyramid's little skinny cousin. It started moving its head like it was analyzing my room, trying to figure out its surroundings. The arms were slightly moving as like a Disney animatronic in a nearly static pose, but barely moving. The noise completely subsided almost instantly after I saw it. I keep trying to focus on the creature to see if it could be the pillows making a shape. My eyes seem to never get used to the darkness. I subconsciously start crying silently, frozen in absolute terror. I felt like if I were to make a noise, breathe, or move, this thing would lunge at me. Eventually, me and this thing had a long staring contest. It felt like I couldn't blink, and if I did, it would be gone. It felt like forever before I could muster up enough courage to quickly snatch my phone, turn on flash, and it was gone. I sighed, and it felt like I hadn't breathed that whole time. I was basically shaking in fear. It was 5 a.m., and I just started playing on my phone because that was crazy. I just don't get it. I've never had sleep paralysis ever, and never really had nightmares. It also couldn't be me being asleep or half asleep, because the second I saw it, my heart started to race and my body filled with adrenaline. After that time, I haven't seen it, but I think about from time to time, which doesn't make sense if it was a dream, because I usually don't dream either, and when I do, I can rarely remember it. I will gladly answer any questions and will appreciate on any explanation possible on what it was. This happened back in either 2000 or 2001. I can't really remember which, but it was around there, so quite a while ago. I have a group of friends that loves the outdoors and loves to explore different areas around the country. We've been all over from East Coast to West, North, and South. It's been a lot of fun over the years. I prefer the north as I'm not a fan of being hot and sweaty, but we vote on where we're going next. So we got the group together and half chose to go to Big Cypress National Preserve in Florida. I wanted to go to Alaska, but it was only me and my buddy John who chose Alaska, unfortunately. I agreed on Florida on the condition we didn't go in the summer, which was debated for about an hour over lunch. Finally, I convinced enough of my friends that it was a good idea. We compromised on going in September, where it's still warm but not excruciatingly hot, like in the middle of summer. We planned on hiking, biking, canoeing, and staying at multiple campsites throughout the park. We'd even planned to try some of the primitive sites, without all the modern creature comforts. We decided we'd check out Everglades National Park as well, since it's right next door to Big Cypress. We drove east down the main road called the Tamiami Trail to the scenic route that brought us to the Concho Billy Trail. Finally, we get to the trail park the cars and get our bikes out. We all took pictures of the green Concho Trail sign. And that's when we first smelled something rank, kind of skunk-like. That's not unusual, though, out in nature, and we set out on the trail. The smell passed pretty quickly, about 10 minutes into our ride. We stopped again after about a mile and heard this loud call from the trees. It was low, almost a rumble, but it carried. We all just looked at each other and put our fingers up to our lips. I know there's no mountain lions in the park, but I wasn't sure if there was a bear or not. Twice we heard it call out, and my friend Annie even recorded it on her phone. We waited after the second call about 20 minutes. Then we got back on our bikes and took off. We traveled barely half a mile more when we heard the call again. We stopped to listen, and then we smelled an awful rank smell again. This time it was like a mix of skunk and strong urine. That's the best I can describe it. The call seemed farther out than we'd heard before, but the smell seemed to just permeate the entire area. It was incredibly strong, and he decided to record the sounds again with her phone. We stayed there maybe 10 minutes, and something crashed in the trees off to our right, maybe 30 feet away from us. We didn't stay to see what it was. We got on our bikes, and we hauled as fast as we could back to the cars. I don't know what it was. We got back in the cars and took off back to camp. We were all laughing at each other and kind of freaking out together. We got back to camp, and we told our story to a few people, even played the recordings. No one knew what it was, but we did learn that there is indeed black bear that live in the preserve. What we heard wasn't a bear, though, and that smell seemed to show up with the calls. We've had odd encounters before in our travels, but this one takes the cake. To this day, no one knows what we heard. We've played the calls to many people, even some animal people. You know, hunters and some rangers we've met in our travels. No one can identify the calls. It's really strange. Thanks for listening. Hope to see you tomorrow, son.